The old house, a sentinel of weathered stone and dark timber, stood as a monument to the generations of the Hawthorne family who had lived, laughed, and wept within its sturdy walls for over a century. It was more than a structure, it was the physical anchor of their identity, the unshakable certainty in a world of flux. For Elias Hawthorne, a man whose 70 years had etched lines of deep wisdom around his eyes, and for his daughter, Clara, a sharp 40-year-old mother and school teacher, the house was the silent third parent to Clara's two teenage children, Marcus and Sophia. Elias sat in his favorite armchair, the late afternoon sun spilling across the worn Persian rug, turning the dust motes into dancing specks of gold. Clara was in the kitchen, her mind half on the lesson plans for Monday, and half on the low, comforting rumble of her father's familiar humming. The quiet was profound, the peace they had come to take for granted. A sharp, impersonal rap on the front door shattered the stillness. It wasn't the sound of a friendly neighbor or a delivery person. It was the sound of an official summons. Clara wiped her hands on a dish towel, her brow furrowing slightly. She opened the heavy oak door to find a young man standing stiffly on the porch, his face devoid of warmth, holding a thick manila envelope. He was impeccably dressed, a corporate drone in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the home's rustic charm. "Ms. Clara Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice flat, a practiced formality masking utter disinterest. "Yes, that's me," Clara replied, a knot beginning to tighten in her stomach. Instinct told her this was not a welcome visit. "I'm instructed to deliver this document to you personally. Please sign here." He presented a clipboard with a space marked for her signature, an official-looking log sheet detailing the time and date. She signed, her hand feeling strangely detached, watching as the young man handed her the heavy envelope, and vanished as quickly and silently as he had arrived, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive cologne and a profound sense of foreboding. Clara carried the envelope to the dining room table, its weight feeling suddenly immense. Elias had stopped humming. He pushed himself up from the armchair, his eyes keen with a quiet apprehension that mirrored her own. Marcus and Sophia drifted in from their homework, their youthful curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the house's atmosphere. They were a circle now, a family unit instinctively gathering against an unseen threat. Clara carefully tore open the seal, her breath held tight in her chest. She pulled out a stack of documents, the top one a formal letter with a header she didn't recognize. Omnia Holdings Group, LLC. The language was dense, legalistic, and aggressive. She scanned the first paragraph, then the second, her face draining of color with every line she read. Her hand began to tremble, and she had to place the document flat on the table to keep reading. "Clara? What is it?" Elias's voice was low, heavy with decades of life experience, an anchor steadying a drifting boat. She didn't answer immediately. She couldn't. The words she had just read were an impossible absurdity. She cleared her throat, forcing the air back into her lungs. "It's a notice of possession," she finally managed to articulate, the words tasting like ash. "It says that this property, was legally transferred to Omnia Holdings Group 3 months ago. It states that we are now occupying the house without a lease and that we must vacate the premises within 60 days. A silence descended on the room, heavier and more terrifying than the one the messenger had broken. Marcus, who had been leaning over his mother's shoulder, straightened up, his teenage bravado cracking. "Vacate? Mom, that's crazy. This is Grandpa's house. Our house. They can't just say that." "They're not just saying it, Marcus," Elias said, his voice flat but his eyes blazing with a suppressed fire. He took the document from Clara, his large, aged hands holding the paper with unexpected steadiness. He read it slowly, meticulously, moving past the aggressive legalese to the root of the claim. They claim a quitclaim deed was filed and recorded in the county land office. They're stating a legitimate transfer of title took place. He looked up, his gaze meeting Clara's. "This is not a mistake. This is a deliberate legal action." Clara leaned against the table, feeling suddenly dizzy. "How? Papa, how could a deed have been filed? We never signed anything. You never signed anything. You've been the sole owner since Grandma passed." The thought of fraud, of someone so brazenly attempting to steal the ground beneath their feet sent a spike of cold fury through her. Elias walked over to his old mahogany desk in the corner, a piece of furniture as old as the house itself. He unlocked a small, hidden drawer, pulling out a sheaf of thick yellow documents bound with a ribbon. It was the original deed, the family's proof, signed by his own father. He placed it next to the Omnia Holdings Group document. The deed is here. It is safe. They must have forged something or found a flaw, a loophole we don't know about. His composure was remarkable, born of a deep-seated faith that saw this not as an insurmountable disaster, but as a test of integrity and perseverance. "We need a lawyer now," Clara said, the teacher in her taking over, seeking a rational plan of attack. "We'll call Mr. Davies first thing tomorrow. We'll get an injunction. We'll prove this is fraudulent." But the legal notice was a cold, efficient instrument of distress. The last page wasn't a warning. It was a formal writ of summons. It detailed not one, but 3 simultaneous lawsuits: a suit for ejectment to remove them from the property, a suit for slander of title against Elias, and a claim for damages from alleged lost corporate revenue during their illegal occupation. The claim for damages alone was a staggering, utterly ruinous figure. Sophia, the quieter and more sensitive of the 2 children, read the amount for damages over her mother's shoulder. Her voice was a terrified whisper. $5 million? Mom, we don't have $5 million. Elias looked at the number. The figure was designed for one purpose: intimidation. It was meant to make them collapse before the fight even started. "They're trying to drown us in paper and fear, children. That's what powerful people do." He folded the original deed and tucked it back into the drawer, securing the lock. "They think we will settle. They think we will walk away because the fight is too costly, too frightening. And we won't," Clara stated, her voice hardening with resolve. The fear was still there, but it was now overlaid with a fierce, protective anger. "We won't give them this house, not a single inch of it." She looked at her father, then at her children, drawing strength from the unbroken line of their family. "We will fight them with the truth, Papa. We have the truth, and we have our faith." She knew this was going to be more than a legal battle. It was going to be a battle for their family's very soul. Elias nodded, his gaze distant, as if seeing beyond the present moment. "Yes, Clara, but the kind of power that can fabricate a deed and file 3 lawsuits simultaneously, that kind of power doesn't make simple mistakes. They are organized, they are ruthless, and they will have covered their tracks very well." He took the Omnia Holdings envelope and placed it under the bright light of the kitchen lamp. "We must find their weakness, their lie." Clara reached for her phone to search for Omnia Holdings Group. The results were immediate and overwhelming. The company was a massive multinational real estate and development conglomerate, its name attached to gleaming high-rises and sprawling luxury resorts. The CEO's picture appeared on a financial news site, a stern, imposing woman named Vivian Thorne, whose reputation for aggressive acquisitions was legendary. Their logo, a stylized interlocking triangle, felt suddenly menacing, a symbol of cold mathematical efficiency. The sheer scale of their power made the Hawthorne family's fight look like a child throwing pebbles at a tank. "Papa, this company is enormous. Why us? Why this house? It's not in the city. It's not on prime commercial land." Elias's eyes narrowed, a flicker of deep suspicion crossing his face. "That's the question, isn't it? They don't buy a single-family home in the quiet countryside for a few $1 million when they're worth billions. They want something under the house, or something around it, something we don't see." He picked up the legal notice again, his attention drawn to a footnote on the ejectment suit, a seemingly innocuous reference to mineral rights and access easements that had been included in the contested deed. He knew the land had been the subject of rumors decades ago, whispers of untapped resources. He had dismissed them as old wives' tales, but the language of the suit gave him pause. "There's more to this, Clara," he said, his voice dropping to a serious tone. "It's not just the house, it's the land, and their claim of ownership goes back to a single specific transaction date in 1948, a date no one in the family ever talked about, no one I ever heard of." He tapped the document, his finger resting on the mysterious date. "They're claiming their ownership stems from a time before my father even had the deed I have." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A secret transaction, a hidden history in their very foundation. The possibility that their family's hold on the house was not as absolute as they believed was terrifying. 1948. What happened in 1948? Elias looked around the familiar room, the silent witness to their lives. If they can prove a legitimate transfer happened then, a transfer that was never fully rescinded or properly recorded, then our deed, the one we have cherished for 3 generations, might be worthless. A sudden sharp sound from the doorway startled them. Sophia had dropped a glass of water. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the shards glistening under the kitchen light like tiny fragmented mirrors. She wasn't looking at the broken glass, but at the legal document, her eyes wide with unadulterated fear. "Papa," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What if they can prove it?" Elias stared down at the documents, the name Omnia Holdings Group mocking him. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that the battle for the house was only the beginning. It was a lock that was only now being picked. But as he looked at the children, he saw something else, something deeper. He knew he had to protect not just the house, but their faith in the principle of justice itself. He would not let a faceless corporation teach his grandchildren that integrity and truth were weak defenses against money and power. He straightened up, a resolve settling in his shoulders. "We will find out what happened in 1948, he stated firmly. "We will find the truth of this property, even if it means tearing apart every record this family has ever kept." But as he made that promise, his gaze drifted back to the legal notice. Tucked into the very back of the packet, on a separate sheet marked Confidential Exhibit A, was a faded black and white photograph. It was a picture of a young man, a stranger, standing on the steps of their house taken decades ago. And handwritten across the bottom, in elegant archaic script, was a single cryptic sentence. "The key is not in the ground, but in the name." Elias slowly picked up the photo, his heart pounding a sudden erratic rhythm against his ribs. The young man in the photo looked vaguely familiar, a ghost of a resemblance he couldn't place. He turned the photo over, hoping for a name, date, anything. The back was blank save for the faint imprint of a rubber stamp from a defunct Metropolitan Archives office. The truth of their house was now wrapped in a 60-year-old mystery, a photograph, and a riddle, and the deadline to vacate was 60 days away. He looked at Clara, his usual steady calm finally fractured by the weight of this new personal mystery, a secret that had been buried deeper than any title. "This is not fraud, Clara," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "This is personal. Someone in our past was involved in this, and Omnia knows about it. They didn't just find a mistake in a deed. They found a secret." The first phone call to the Hawthorne family's long-standing legal counsel, Mr. Davies, was less reassuring than Clara had desperately hoped. She had spent the remainder of the evening after the notice arrived researching Omnia Holdings, compiling the names of their board members, and trying to find any public scandal attached to Vivian Thorne. Elias, meanwhile, had begun his archaeological dig into the family's attic, the silence of the old house amplifying the creak of the floorboards under his heavy steps. He was searching for anything tied to 1948, any old letter, diary, or financial record that might shed light on the photograph and the cryptic note. Clara sat in Mr. Davies's sterile wood-paneled office the next morning, the thick stack of Omnia's lawsuits spread across his immense desk. Mr. Davies, a man nearing retirement with a kind face and 30 years of local property law experience, adjusted his glasses, his expression growing grimmer with every page he reviewed. "Clara, Elias," he began, pushing the documents back toward them. "I'm going to be completely honest. This isn't a simple title dispute. This is a targeted, scorched earth legal campaign designed to crush you financially before you even reach the discovery phase." Clara gripped the edge of her chair. "But the deed we have, the one Papa's father signed in 55, it's ironclad. How can they claim prior ownership? The land office records show continuous Hawthorne ownership." "That's the cleverness of it," Mr. Davies sighed, rubbing his temples. "Omnia Holdings isn't arguing that your deed is fake. They're arguing it's secondary. They are using the doctrine of adverse possession combined with a claim of a lost or unrecorded chain of title transaction from 1948. They believe that even if your grandfather thought he owned it, he wasn't the first person to claim legitimate ownership after a certain point." The mineral rights mentioned too is a powerful leverage point. Large corporations often use that to establish a claim to the subsurface rights, which can then be used to challenge surface ownership. Elias leaned forward, his calm a stark contrast to Clara's rising panic. Mr. Davies, they reference a specific transaction date in 1948. Do you have any record of a transfer in that year that didn't involve the Hawthorne name? Davies typed on his computer, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. We searched the public index. Nothing official, no. However, their suit includes a notarized affidavit of transfer from 1948, allegedly signed by a third party, a shell corporation, that was dissolved in the 1950s. They are essentially saying that your grandfather bought the land from a party who no longer had the legal right to sell it. A shell corporation that Omnia just happened to find the records for 70 years later? Clara scoffed, the injustice of it burning in her chest. That smells of forgery and corporate raiding. I agree, but we have to prove the forgery. And that leads to the second problem, the financial pressure. Mr. Davies said, tapping the documents detailing the $5 million damages claim. This is a strategic lawsuit against public participation, or SLAP suit disguised as legitimate action. They know you don't have that kind of collateral. The sheer size of the claim allows them to petition the court to freeze your family's assets and place a lien on the house immediately to secure the potential judgment. If we fight this, Omnia will bury us in fees, motions, and discovery demands we can't afford to meet. The reality of the corporation's ruthlessness hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. Frozen assets meant no money for their defense, no money for basic living expenses, and the imminent possibility of losing everything before they even stepped foot in a courtroom. Elias, however, remained resolute. What do you need to begin? Elias asked, ignoring the dire financial warning. We will find a way to fund the fight. We have to. This is about integrity, Mr. Davies. We cannot let them profit from a lie, no matter how clever the legal maneuvering. Mr. Davies admired the old man's spirit, but the reality was crushing. I need two things, Elias. First, a substantial retainer to cover the initial filings and to hire a title expert. Second, I need you to find me the original source of their claim. Who was the young man in that photograph? Who was the third party they claim transferred the deed? Omnia is operating on the assumption that you know nothing about the 1948 transaction. If you can find evidence that your family was aware of a dispute and successfully settled it, or that their 1948 deed was legally invalidated, that is our strongest defense. As they spoke, Mr. Davies' assistant buzzed the intercom. Excuse me, sir. A fax just came in from the regional court office. It's marked urgent filing confirmation. Mr. Davies took the sheet, his eyes scanning the text. His expression turned from concern to shock. He looked up, a wave of professional defeat washing over him. This is bad, truly bad, he admitted, shaking his head slowly. Omnia didn't wait. They filed an ex parte motion last night, a highly unusual move. The judge, evidently persuaded by the alleged severity of the damages and the risk of the property being mismanaged during litigation, has granted an immediate temporary restraining order, TRO, on the property. A restraining order? What does that mean? Clara whispered, her voice barely a thread. It means, Mr. Davies explained, his voice heavy with dread, that until our emergency motion hearing next week, the court has ordered that no alterations, improvements, or financially significant transactions can take place on the property. And worse, the court has also ordered a freeze on the primary liquid assets tied to Elias's name, specifically targeting the savings accounts that would be used to pay our retainer. They have effectively cut off our oxygen supply. Clara felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. They had anticipated a fight, but not a siege. They couldn't hire a lawyer, they couldn't touch their savings, and they couldn't even repair a roof tile without court permission. They were prisoners in their own home, watching their future dissolve through the intricate, cold machinery of corporate law. This is intimidation, Elias stated, his voice steady despite the shock. They are trying to starve us out. They want us to abandon our values and settle for whatever pittance they offer. He looked at Clara, his eyes shining with a deep, uncompromising moral conviction. We leave now, Clara. We go back to the house. The answer isn't in this office, it's in our past. We will face the asset freeze by living frugally, relying on our own strength and the help of our friends in the congregation. But we must find the truth of 1948. Clara rose, picking up the stack of lawsuits. They felt like a monument to organized cruelty. Yes, Papa. We need a name. We need to know who the young man in that photo is. Back at the house, the quiet no longer felt peaceful, but heavy with the weight of the court's decree. Elias went immediately to the attic, ignoring the chill of the unheated space. He was searching through the oldest trunk, smelling the musty scent of forgotten paper and mothballs. Clara joined him, her mind racing through ways to conserve every penny. The children were quiet, sensing the gravity of the situation, their usual carefree teenage noise replaced by a worried silence. Elias pulled out an old leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age. It was his grandmother's meticulous record of household expenses and small local transactions from the 1940s. He flipped through the pages until he reached the entry for 1948. Amidst entries for flour, shoe repair, and church donation, there was a single cryptic notation dated October 14, 1948, the exact month Omnia claimed the transaction took place. The entry was written in faint, elegant script. $50 to SV for Quietus, never to be spoken of again. Elias stared at the words, his heart pounding an urgent rhythm. Clara, look at this. $50 to SV for Quietus. A payment made for silence, a transaction never to be discussed. SV? Clara pondered, tracing the faded Inca with her finger. Could that be the young man in the photo? Who is SV? And Quietus? It means a release or discharge, a legal closure. Elias pulled the photograph from his pocket. The face of the young man was staring back at him, the ghost of a secret. Suddenly, the resemblance Elias had struggled to place snapped into sharp focus. The strong jawline, the deep-set eyes, the slight tilt of the head, it was an uncanny echo of someone he knew, someone he saw regularly. Clara, Elias breathed, his voice barely a rasp. I know who he is, or rather, I know who he is related to. He held the photograph next to the name SV's in the ledger. It's the eyes. The family resemblance is unmistakable. That young man, SV, is the father of a man who still lives in this town, a man we both see every week, a man whose integrity we trust completely. A wave of profound dread washed over Clara. The implication of their close connection to this historical secret, this transaction that threatened their entire future, was chilling. You mean a betrayal from someone we know now? Elias shook his head, refusing to jump to the conclusion of malice. No, I mean a secret, a mistake, something someone in our family tried to bury a long time ago. We have to speak to his son, Clara. If we can find out who SV was, we can find out what this Quietus was for. That is the key to proving Omnia's fraudulent claim. But we have to move fast. With our assets frozen, every hour counts. He looked at the ledger, then at the photo, the weight of a 70-year-old family secret pressing down on him. The knowledge that the answer lay with a trusted member of their community was a shocking, dangerous revelation. It meant the line between their fight and a profound personal crisis was about to vanish completely. Clara picked up the ledger, her mind reeling from the potential for catastrophic betrayal. We have to be careful, Papa. If this man's son doesn't know, or worse, if he does know and is involved, we could be walking into a trap. Elias looked at her, his expression resolute. We rely on faith, Clara, not suspicion. We will go to him with the truth and appeal to his conscience, trusting that he will help us uncover his father's actions. But first, we need confirmation. I need to know his full name. He closed the ledger. The scent of age and untold secrets thickened the air. I'll go to the archives myself, discreetly. I'll find a record of this man. As he turned to leave the attic, a barely visible scrap of paper, brittle and yellowed, fluttered down from the bottom of the old ledger. Clara picked it up. It was a formal typed letter on the letterhead of a long-defunct local law firm. The date was December 1948. The letter was addressed to Elias's grandfather, and the text was terrifyingly clear. We regret to inform you that your purchase of the property was found to be in violation of the existing covenant of the previous owner, Mr. S.V. The full name was here, matching the name of the local man's father. Your title is hereby considered voidable unless you agree to the stipulated terms of easement rights. It was the smoking gun, the confirmation that their title had indeed been vulnerable 70 years ago. The family hadn't secured their ownership as fully as they believed. The Quiatis had failed. The danger was real, and Omnia Holdings had not been lying about the flaw in their title. They had merely waited for the most opportune moment to strike, armed with a devastating family secret. Clara's hand trembled, the paper rustling softly. Papa, the title was voidable. They knew, all along. We never fully owned it. She looked at the full name written on the letter, the name of the local man's father. The key is not in the ground, but in the name, Elias murmured, remembering the cryptic note on the photograph. The name itself was the weakness. If the man is who I think he is, Clara said, her voice shaking with the shock of the revelation, then he is the person who holds the key to the easement rights and the mineral claims. And if Omnia Holdings has secured his cooperation, Papa, we don't just face a legal battle, we face a betrayal of trust from a spiritual brother. We need to go to him, but we need to do it tonight, before Omnia makes their next move. The thought of confronting a trusted family friend, a man whose father had been linked to their property's darkest secret, sent a wave of nausea through her. The legal battle had just become agonizingly personal, threatening not just their home, but the very fabric of their community. The asset freeze hit the Hawthorne family like a slow-moving, debilitating fever. The immediate suffocating fear was not of losing the house in some abstract future, but of not being able to buy groceries next week. Clara and Elias sat with Mr. Davies late into the night, mapping out a financial strategy that involved selling a few modest family-owned heirloom pieces and borrowing small sums from close, trusted friends in their faith community, all done quietly, ethically, and without violating the letter of the temporary restraining order on Elias's main accounts. Their spiritual principles demanded that they fight justly and maintain financial integrity, even while under siege. "This is the cruelty of it, Clara," Elias said, his voice quiet as they drove home through the dark. "Omnia is not just suing us. They are using the law as a weapon to restrict our basic liberty. They want to make us feel desperate, like there is no alternative but surrender." He looked out the window at the familiar turn into their long, winding driveway. "We will not allow them to make us desperate. We will be patient, and we will be frugal." The next morning, the intimidation began in earnest. Before the sun had fully risen, a large matte black SUV idled at the edge of their property line. Two men in neon yellow vests, clearly not from the local county office, began placing bright orange flags deep in the forest bordering their land. Clara watched from the kitchen window, her hand instinctively resting on Sophia's shoulder. "They are trespassing," Marcus observed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "No, Marcus, they're not," Clara corrected, her voice weary. "They're Omnia's private surveyors. They likely have an injunction permitting them to establish boundary lines, or they're simply relying on the fact that a large corporation planting flags will look legitimate to any local police who might drive by. It's a calculated psychological move. They are literally staking their claim." Later that day, a young razor-sharp attorney from Omnia's firm, a woman named Miss Kincaid, arrived at their front door. She didn't smile, nor did she offer a handshake. She presented Clara with a box, a heavy cardboard box the size of a microwave oven. "This is our initial set of discovery demands and interrogatories," Ms. Kincaid stated, her voice clipped and professional. "You have 30 days to respond. Be advised that failure to provide all requested documents and comprehensive answers under oath will result in a motion for default judgment." Clara managed to keep her hand steady as she took the box. It was impossibly heavy, filled with thousands of pages. She knew, even before opening it, that the demands would be staggering. Every financial record from the last 20 years, every communication regarding the property, detailed personal histories of Elias and Clara, and no doubt the names and addresses of every person who had ever visited the house. It was a lawyer's war of attrition, designed to consume every waking moment of their lives and force them to spend money they didn't have to hire a team of paralegals. Elias walked into the foyer, his expression unreadable. "Omnia Holdings is a public company," he said to Ms. Kincaid, his voice measured and calm. "They have a moral responsibility to uphold integrity and transparency. Why are you pursuing litigation based on what we believe to be a deeply flawed and potentially fraudulent historical document?" Miss Kincaid simply gave him a condescending, pitying look. Mr. Hawthorne, Omnia Holdings is protecting its property rights and its substantial investment. The court will determine the validity of the documents. For now, the court recognizes our standing. I suggest you dedicate your time to answering those demands. With that, she turned and strode back to the black SUV, leaving the heavy box on the hardwood floor like a monument to their impossible task. Clara knelt beside the box, its weight a physical representation of the legal burden. Papa, look at this. We can't do this alone. It will take every moment of every day, and we still won't meet the deadline. Then we will prioritize, Elias said, placing a hand on the lid of the box. We will respond to every request truthfully, but we will not allow their paperwork to distract us from our core. Mission: Finding SV's son. Their meeting with David Vance, the man Elias had recognized through the photograph's unmistakable resemblance, was scheduled for that evening. David was a trusted elder in their local congregation, a man whose reputation for honesty and calm judgment was absolute. The thought of bringing their crisis to him and potentially revealing a hidden stain on his own family history was a profound moral dilemma. They prayed together before leaving, asking for the right words to speak, words of gentle inquiry, not judgment. They met David at his quiet, small woodworking shop, the smell of sawdust and varnish, a comforting, honest scent. David looked surprised to see them, his face warm with his usual easy smile. Clara did not mince words. She placed the old photograph, the 1948 voidable title letter, and a copy of Omnia's lawsuit on his work table. David, we are fighting to save our home. Omnia Holdings is basing their claim on an alleged transfer that happened in 1948 involving a man named SV, an avoidable title that was never legally corrected. We believe SV was your father, Samuel Vance. David's smile vanished. He picked up the photograph, his hand shaking slightly as he recognized his young father, a man he had rarely spoken of. He was silent for a long moment, staring at the ghostly image. He then turned to the letter, his eyes scanning the archaic legal text about the easement rights. Yes, David finally said, his voice low and heavy with a sadness Elias recognized as a memory long suppressed. Samuel Vance was my father. He died when I was young, and yes, my mother once told me, years ago, when she was frail and near the end, that my father had been involved in something unwise with the Hawthorne property a long time ago. She said it was cleaned up by your grandfather, but that there was a piece of paper that should have been burned but wasn't. She never elaborated, never gave me the full name, out of loyalty to your family. Clara leaned in, her anxiety overwhelming the formality of the situation. David, Omnia is using this old claim to try and take our house. They are leveraging the mineral rights that your father's voidable title left on the land. Do you know anything about the terms of that easement, or where that final piece of paper might be? David sighed, running a weary hand over his face. When I inherited this shop from my father, I also inherited a small locked filing cabinet. I've never opened it, Elias. I felt it was best to leave the past buried. I respected my mother's wish for quietus. But now I see this is necessary. He walked over to a steel cabinet nestled in a dark corner of the shop and produced a small tarnished silver key. As he opened the drawer, revealing a few dusty folders, Elias's phone rang. It was Mr. Davies, his voice breathless and frantic. Elias, you need to hear this, the lawyer rushed out. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Omnia has filed their most aggressive motion yet. They've petitioned the court for the immediate appointment of a temporary receiver for your property. They are arguing that the TRO and asset freeze aren't enough, claiming the property is at risk of irreparable damage and waste due to your alleged inability to maintain it, and the pending multi-million-dollar damage claim. If the judge grants this, Elias, they will put a corporation in charge of your home. You'll be locked out of the finances, locked out of the decision-making, and essentially become tenants in your own house, subject to the receiver's rules. The news struck Elias with a brutal force that dwarfed the earlier shock of the discovery demands. The receiver motion wasn't about money or fraud. It was about control. It was a direct, humiliating attempt to strip them of their dignity and the very essence of home ownership before the trial even began. We will fight it, Mr. Davies, Elias stated, his voice tight with suppressed rage. File an emergency opposition immediately. Cite the long family history and the fact that we have an active maintenance schedule. We are not neglecting our property. We are being unlawfully harassed. Elias hung up the phone, his face grim. The fight had escalated from a legal inconvenience to an immediate threat to their sanctuary. He turned back to David, who had pulled a single-age document from the cabinet. It was a formal, notarized release of covenant and full quitclaim signed by Samuel Vance in 1956, years after the alleged initial voidable title. "This is it," David whispered, his hand shaking, his finger pointing to the date. "My father settled this years later. He righted the wrong. He gave up any claim to the property and the easements. This is the piece of paper my mother spoke of." Claire and Elias stared at the document. It was proof. It was the antidote to Omnia's entire lawsuit. The full quitclaim, if valid, completely invalidated Omnia's 1948 claim. "This changes everything," Clara breathed, tears of relief pricking her eyes. "David, you have saved us." But as David slid the document over the table, his eyes were full of a fresh, raw guilt. "Wait, Elias. There is something else. This isn't the only thing my father filed. There was another filing, a public one, just 1 month before this final release. My mother told me it was a terrible thing he did, something he regretted until the day he died. He made a filing to the county archives, swearing under oath that the 1948 transaction was legitimate and that he was granting an irrevocable option to purchase the mineral rights to a newly formed unnamed holding company. All this while he was still trying to secretly sell his land rights back to your grandfather." David's voice broke. The reason he filed this final good deed in 1956 was to cover up the horrible thing he did in 1955. He sold an option to the mineral rights to an unknown third party, the very party Omnia Holdings is now claiming to be the successor to. "It's a legal landmine, Elias. He tried to sell the land twice. He made a vow to your grandfather, but he signed away the mineral rights to a corporation called Ethelred Acquisitions in 1955. And just last week, Omnia Holdings bought Ethelred Acquisitions specifically for that one option." Clara reeled back, the joy over the quitclaim instantly obliterated by the devastating revelation of the mineral rights option. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate legal betrayal by a trusted neighbor, a moral lapse that had waited 70 years to be unearthed. The fight was about to become infinitely more complex and 1,000 times more dangerous. The option was likely ironclad, giving Omnia a legitimate claim to what lay beneath the Hawthorne home, a claim that would make the house itself worthless. Elias looked at David, his face etched with sorrow but not accusation. "Thank you for your integrity, David. Your father's choice does not reflect on yours. We will use this final quitclaim to fight the house claim, but this mineral rights option, this is the real target. This is why Omnia is here." David nodded, but a coldness had settled in his eyes. "Elias, when I took this file out, I also saw a letter from a legal firm in Chicago, dated just 3 months ago, the same month Omnia served you. The letter was addressed to me, offering a substantial sum to confirm the validity of my father's 1955 mineral rights option with Ethelred. I never responded, but they already had all the information." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper of profound shock. "The letter was signed by Ms. Kincaid, the attorney who served you that box of demands today. Omnia didn't just stumble upon this secret. They've been hunting this specific document for months, and they knew the son of SV was the key. They just served us the lawsuits, but their real plan began with the attempt to buy my silence." Elias and Clara stared at the quitclaim, now rendered nearly useless by the mineral rights option. The confrontation had not ended their problems. It had revealed that the legal battle was merely the surface of a deep, coordinated corporate conspiracy. They now knew the enemy's motive and method, but they also knew that Omnia was already 2 steps ahead. David Vance's honest confession was a spiritual victory, but a crushing legal defeat. Omnia had them cornered, and the judge was about to rule on the motion to appoint a receiver, a motion that would turn the Hawthorne family into spectators of their own ruin. The drive back from David Vance's shop was conducted in a dense, suffocating silence. The truth they had uncovered, the 2 conflicting documents from Samuel Vance, the righteous quitclaim and the damning mineral rights option, was a legal paradox that perfectly mirrored the human complexity of the situation. David had given them the proof of his father's final integrity, but also the blueprint for the corporation's insidious attack. Elias held the brittle 1956 quitclaim, which protected the house, and the knowledge of the 1955 mineral rights option, which condemned the land beneath it. They met Mr. Davies again, delivering the documents and the entire story in a breathless rush. The lawyer's face, already worn from lack of sleep, tightened with the professional strain of absorbing the catastrophic double revelation. "The quitclaim is excellent," Mr. Davies conceded, tracing the faded ink. "It gives us a powerful defense against the ejectment suit. It proves your grandfather was right to trust SV in the end. But the mineral rights option, that is the crux of the problem. If Samuel Vance legally granted an irrevocable option to a corporate predecessor of Omnia Holdings in 1955, and Omnia can prove Ethelred Acquisitions was a legitimate entity, then Omnia's primary claim to the valuable subsurface rights is likely sound. The surface rights, the house, become a mere obstruction to their real goal, which is extraction, and a multi-billion-dollar corporation will demolish the obstruction without a second thought." "But what about the motion for the temporary receiver?" Clara asked, the urgency of that immediate threat overshadowing the complexities of the mineral rights. "The judge is ruling any hour now." "I filed the opposition, citing the financial freeze as the real cause of their fabricated claims of waste. But Omnia's legal team is formidable," Mr. Davies admitted, shaking his head. "They argued that with the $5 million damages suit pending, the court must protect the asset for Omnia, essentially treating you as irresponsible debtors. We can only wait for the judge's decision but prepare for the worst. If the receiver is appointed, our legal defense becomes 10 times harder, as every decision, every expenditure, will be subject to their corporate oversight." Elias, however, had already pivoted. His mind, honed by decades of thoughtful study of historical texts, was fixed on a single compelling idea. The flaw in the claim must be older than Samuel Vance. SV made a mistake in 1955, Mr. Davies. He sold something he thought he owned. But what if he never had the right to sell it in the first place? What if the land itself, when it first passed out of the public domain and into private hands, had a covenant, a restriction, placed on those mineral rights by the original land grantor? That kind of restriction is often buried deep in the foundational documentation, the true original chain of title. Mr. Davies frowned, running a hand through his thin hair. "That is highly speculative, Elias. We're talking about a document from the turn of the century, and even if such a restriction exists, proving its validity after 100 years of subsequent deeds would be monumental." "Then monumental is what we must do," Elias declared, his quiet voice holding an absolute certainty. "Omnia is banking on the fact that an elderly man's dusty attic cannot compete with their vast legal resources and their team of historical title researchers. They made a calculation error. They underestimated a father's determination to protect his children's legacy." Clara and Elias returned to the old house, the weight of the coming verdict on the receiver motion hanging over them like a physical cloud. They knew they could no longer rely on the deeds from the 1950s. The key had to be much, much older. Elias ascended to the attic alone, a single oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows on the exposed beams. He ignored the trunks related to his father and grandfather. He went straight to a small iron-bound chest that had belonged to his great-grandfather, Silas Hawthorne, the man who first brought the family to the property in 1918. The chest was tucked away beneath a loose floorboard, a silent vault of the family's true foundation. The chest smelled not of dust and mothballs, but of old leather and pipe tobacco. Inside, Elias found a chaotic repository of the family's first decades. Old bills of sale for livestock, handwritten spiritual notes, and several brittle maps of the region. He sifted through dozens of meaningless scraps until his hand brushed against a document of unexpected thickness. It was a formal engraved document titled Deed of Trust and Boundary Settlement, dated June 12, 1928. As he unfolded it, the legal language leaped out at him. The document concerned a decades-old boundary dispute Silas Hawthorne had with a powerful local landowner. The name of that landowner, listed in elegant script as the grantor, sent a tremor through Elias. It was Amos Thorne, the very surname of the Omnia Holdings CEO, Vivian Thorne. The fight to save their home was not a new one. It was a century-old multi-generational conflict against the same lineage. The document detailed the 1928 resolution, which allowed Silas to keep his boundary in exchange for a set of meticulously defined covenants on the land. Elias's heart began to race as he scanned the densely worded clauses, recognizing the archaic legal terminology. Clause 4b, labeled Subsurface Transfer Restriction, stated, in language as clear as a bell, that in perpetuity the mineral rights could never be transferred to any entity outside the local township for the purpose of large-scale extraction, unless the local municipal zoning board unanimously approved, citing a compelling local economic benefit. Furthermore, the covenant stipulated that if such a transfer were attempted in violation of this clause, the mineral rights would automatically revert to the original grantor's surviving heirs. Elias gasped. Silas Hawthorne, his great-grandfather, had foresightedly protected his land not by securing a deed that was impossible to break, but by establishing a legal restriction that made the land worthless to the kind of corporate greed that now threatened them. The covenant predated Samuel Vance's 1955 option by nearly 30 years. SV's option was therefore void ab initio, invalid from the start, because he had attempted to sell a right, mineral extraction, that was already legally encumbered and restricted. He had sold a promise he had no legal power to keep. Elias leaned back against the dusty wall, the single sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hands. This was not merely proof, it was the entire foundation of Omnia's scheme, shattered by a 100-year-old agreement. The corporation had likely never seen this document. They had found the 1955 option, assumed it was the earliest crack in the title, and used it to launch their attack, never digging deep enough to find the ultimate source of the land's protection. He immediately called Clara, who was downstairs trying to work through the paralyzing stack of discovery demands. Her voice was strained with fatigue and fear. "Clara, stop the paperwork, stop everything. Come to the attic now. Bring the Omnia lawsuit, the part that mentions the mineral rights." When she arrived, Elias carefully pointed to the crucial 1928 clause. Clara read it, her eyes widening from disbelief to dawning realization, and finally to a fierce protective joy. "Papa, this means they have no claim," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The local zoning board no longer exists in that form, and Omnia is clearly an entity outside the local township. The option is worthless. We have it, Papa. We have the proof." The relief that washed over her was so profound it almost buckled her knees. She sank onto the dusty floor beside him. "This is the truth we have been praying for, Clara," Elias said, gently touching the paper. "It proves our great-grandfather's integrity protected us all along. We will call Mr. Davies immediately. He must file this as an affirmative defense and a counterclaim. We must hit Omnia with the truth they tried to bury." Just as Clara reached for her phone, Elias's phone, resting beside the old iron chest, began to ring. It was Mr. Davies. Elias answered, his voice strong with the new discovery. "Mr. Davies, we found it. A 1928 covenant. It invalidates the entire mineral rights option. Omnia's claim is baseless. We have the silver bullet." There was a moment of deep silence on the other end of the line, followed by a long, heavy sigh that sounded like the collapse of stone. "Elias," Mr. Davies's voice was leaden, crushing, completely devoid of the usual professional optimism. "I wish you had called me 5 minutes ago. The judge's ruling just came down. I've been served the order. Omnia's motion was granted. The court has appointed a temporary receiver for the Hawthorne property, effective tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. They beat us to the punch. You found the covenant, but you no longer control the house. The receiver will take control of all management decisions, and they are authorized to begin a comprehensive assessment of the property's assets and liabilities." The elation of finding the 1928 document froze instantly, replaced by a deep, numbing horror. The timing was a cruel twist of fate, a perfect corporate maneuver. They had found the weapon to win the war, but they had just lost control of the battlefield. The house was no longer their sanctuary, it was now a corporate asset under the temporary management of their enemy. Clara stared at the ancient document and then at her father, her eyes reflecting the awful truth. The comprehensive assessment the receiver was authorized to conduct would inevitably lead them to search every corner of the property, every file, every record, including perhaps the very attic where Elias had just found the covenant. They had found the key to their salvation, but they were now trapped with it, locked inside their own home, which was about to be thoroughly searched by the very corporation they were trying to expose. "The covenant," Elias murmured, his eyes fixed on the attic door. "We have to hide it. We can't let them find the truth before we file it with the court." But the chilling reality was even worse. The judge's order had granted the receiver the power to restrict their access to legal documents that pertained to the property, citing Omnia's ongoing $5 million damages suit. If they tried to smuggle the document out to Mr. Davies, they could be accused of concealing evidence, a charge that would ruin their credibility and land Elias in deep legal trouble. The house was now a cage, and the truth they desperately needed to save themselves was now a deeply incriminating secret they were forced to conceal within the walls of the home they no longer controlled. Omnia was in charge, and the first item on the receiver's agenda would undoubtedly be a thorough search of the premises. The fight to save the Hawthorne legacy had just turned into a desperate internal game of hide-and-seek against their corporate overseers. The reality of the temporary receiver descended on the Hawthorne family with cold bureaucratic precision. The next morning, exactly at 9 o'clock, a motorcade of 3 black sedans swept up the driveway. Out stepped a team led by a man named Mr. Sterling, a former corporate auditor with the unblinking gaze of a security camera. He was accompanied by Ms. Kincaid, Omnia's aggressive legal counsel, who offered Clara a patronizingly sympathetic smile that felt like a knife twist. Mr. Sterling presented Elias with a thick binder containing the court order and the receiver's internal mandate. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, "we are here to fulfill the court's order. Effective immediately, all property management decisions, including financial expenditures, maintenance, and access, are under my control. You and your family retain residence, but you must adhere to the receiver's directives. Our first task is a comprehensive inventory and appraisal. We must document all physical assets, including any items of value, and all documents pertaining to the property." Clara watched Ms. Kincaid, who was already surveying the house with a predatory gleam in her eye, clearly anticipating finding something to use against them. The covenant was still hidden in the attic, tucked inside the iron-bound chest beneath the loose floorboard, a fragile shield they dared not expose until Mr. Davies could file the necessary motion in court. Elias maintained a calm, steady dignity that surprised even Clara. He was deeply hurt by the humiliation, but his faith in the ultimate victory of truth gave him a quiet strength. "Mr. Sterling, we understand the court's order. We will cooperate fully with the inventory of physical assets. However, our personal, private, and privileged documents are not part of the property under the terms of the receivership." Ms. Kincaid interjected smoothly, "On the contrary, Mr. Hawthorne, the order explicitly includes a review of all documents that could impact the valuation or title status of the property in light of Omnia's substantial claim for damages and your attempt to conceal potential evidence of the defective title." Her eyes locked with Elias's, a clear, silent challenge. "We know you are hiding something. The Hawthorns were trapped. If they refused to allow access to the attic, they would violate the receiver's mandate and risk being held in contempt of court, a charge that could land Elias in jail and completely ruin their case. If they allowed the search, they would lose the covenant, the one piece of evidence that could save them." Clara took her father's arm. "Papa," she murmured, an urgent, silent plea in her eyes. "We need to buy time." Elias understood. He turned to Mr. Sterling. "We understand the necessity for documentation. However, my children's personal belongings, my late wife's effects, and my spiritual library are protected by privacy. We require a 2-hour grace period to separate these personal items from property records in the presence of my daughter." Mr. Sterling consulted with Ms. Kincaid, who finally gave a slight, reluctant nod. "1 hour, Mr. Hawthorne, and Ms. Hawthorne must be accompanied by one of our team members at all times during that period." The compromise was a concession that felt more like a vice tightening. Clara was ushered upstairs by one of Mr. Sterling's quiet, imposing assistants, a woman named Carol who carried a clipboard and a distinctly uninterested expression. Clara led her to the dusty chaos of the attic, her mind racing. She had 1 hour and one silent guardian. She began quickly moving stacks of old boxes, making a display of organization while desperately searching for an opportunity. The key to the iron chest was in Elias's pocket downstairs. She couldn't access the covenant. She had to communicate with her father. She thought of Sophia and Marcus, who were quietly watching the invaders downstairs, their fear barely concealed. Their unity was their only weapon now. Clara turned to Carol, the assistant. "This dust is unbearable. I need a face mask." "From the mudroom downstairs, next to the kitchen. My father uses them when he cleans up here." Carol consulted her clipboard. "I'll instruct Mr. Hawthorne to send one up with an escort." "No," Clara insisted, with a carefully modulated tone of exasperation. "I need to speak to him briefly about which of these files are his personal tax documents and which are property-related. It's quicker if I go. You can accompany me to the kitchen. The rule is that I cannot be alone, correct?" Carol hesitated, then nodded reluctantly, seeing no risk in a 2-minute trip to the downstairs mudroom with Clara in tow. The moment they reached the kitchen, Clara saw her father and, crucially, Marcus and Sophia. They were sitting at the dining table, pretending to review a school project, while Elias was being casually scrutinized by Mr. Sterling and Ms. Kincaid. Clara walked to the mudroom door, pulling out a cloth mask. She dropped it accidentally on the floor, bending down to pick it up, all while keeping Carol's attention focused on her. In that fleeting moment of distraction, Clara locked eyes with Elias. She spoke not with her voice, but with a series of quick, deliberate gestures. She tapped her left wrist. "Time," then pointed quickly toward the attic, then traced a key shape on her palm, and finally pointed to the chest of drawers in the living room, where the antique iron chest usually sat, but which was now in the attic. Elias understood immediately. Get the covenant out of the attic. Now, he had to get the key from his pocket and signal to the children. Elias stood up, stretching stiffly, his back turned slightly toward Mr. Sterling. He made a show of needing to take a headache pill from the family's small emergency kit, which was kept in the tall grandfather clock in the foyer. As he reached into his pocket for the clock key, a habit the children knew well, he allowed the small silver key to the iron chest to slip quietly into the waiting hand of Marcus, who was leaning against the clock, pretending to adjust his backpack strap. Marcus pocketed the key with the practiced speed of a boy who had been taught to live by the quiet efficiency of integrity and discretion. Elias turned back to Mr. Sterling, the movement covering the quick exchange. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling. My head is aching. The stress of this situation is considerable." Clara and Carol returned upstairs. Marcus waited precisely 30 seconds, establishing a believable gap of time, before announcing loudly that he needed to get a book from his room upstairs to finish his project. Ms. Kincaid, focused on interrogating Elias about the house's utility bills, barely glanced up. Marcus entered the attic, pretending to rummage through a trunk near the door. He was close enough to see his mother and Carol sorting files, but safely out of their immediate perimeter. He moved silently, his heart hammering against his ribs, praying the old floorboards wouldn't betray him. He located the loose floorboard under the pretense of looking for a lost pencil. He knelt, his back to Carol, and lifted the heavy plank with a controlled, agonizing slowness. The scent of old leather and tobacco wafted up. He reached into the hole, fumbling for the iron chest. It was heavy. He couldn't carry the whole chest without a struggle. He had to be surgical. He used the small silver key to unlock the chest, pulling out only the most substantial document, the 1928 covenant. It was thick, stiff paper. Marcus carefully rolled the document into a tight, narrow tube. He knew he couldn't leave the attic carrying a scroll. He looked desperately around the dusty space, his gaze landing on the long, hollow brass rod that served as the curtain rail for a small, high window. It was perfect. He quickly slid the rolled-up 1928 covenant inside the hollow brass rod, replacing the end cap. He replaced the iron chest, the floorboard, and then stood up, breathing a silent prayer of relief. He turned to his mother. "I found my book," he announced, holding up a thick textbook, his expression carefully neutral. Clara gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a shared acknowledgement that the crucial evidence was now safe. The silence of the house, which had once felt like peace, now felt like the tension before a breaking storm. Marcus walked out with the curtain rod under his arm. "Mom asked me to take this down," he explained to Mr. Sterling downstairs, nodding toward the curtain rod. "She wants to wash the curtains for the inventory pictures." Mr. Sterling barely grunted in acknowledgement, the act too mundane to warrant suspicion. Marcus took the rod outside, walking casually to the woodshed behind the house. He quickly pulled the document out of the brass rod and slipped it into a sturdy plastic tube he kept in his backpack for hiking maps, securing the end cap. He had accomplished the impossible. The evidence was safe. But as he walked back towards the house, Mr. Sterling's team began their asset assessment of the surrounding land. Two men, equipped with professional drilling apparatus, began taking soil core samples near the large old oak tree at the far end of the property, precisely the area where the 1928 covenant had drawn the boundary line with Amos Thorne. Mr. Sterling stood nearby, talking softly on his satellite phone, looking entirely too satisfied. Elias, watching from the window, felt a sudden cold dread wash over him. "Clara," he said, his voice strained. "They're not just appraising the house, they're looking for the mineral deposit. They already know the covenant exists, or at least they suspect it. They're looking for evidence of the value of the mineral rights to justify the receiver's continued presence." Just then, Marcus rushed in. "Papa, I got it out. It's safe." He held up the plastic tube. Elias's relief was immense, but it was immediately overshadowed by a new catastrophic insight. "Thank you, son. Now listen closely. They are drilling. They are looking for something. I remember great-grandfather Silas's journals. He was a thoughtful man, and he often spoke of the integrity of the soil. What if, knowing the 1928 covenant restricted future drilling, he took an extreme physical step to ensure the land would be useless to corporate interests?" Clara looked at the drilling team with mounting horror. If the drilling revealed a rich, accessible mineral deposit, Omnia would argue that the covenant was no longer relevant or legally enforceable due to the overwhelming public benefit of the resource, a common legal loophole. "We need to get this to Mr. Davies now," Clara insisted, taking the map tube. "We need to file the counterclaim immediately." But as she reached the door, Ms. Kincaid, who had been listening to Mr. Sterling's satellite phone conversation, walked over, a triumphantly cruel smirk finally breaking through her professional veneer. "Miss Hawthorne, a moment of your time," she announced, her voice dripping with artificial politeness. "The receiver's mandate also includes safeguarding all evidence relevant to the pending $5 million damages suit. A member of our team observed your son exiting the woodshed with a plastic tube. Given the severity of the claims against Mr. Hawthorne, the court has authorized the immediate seizure of any potential evidence being moved off the property. Hand over the tube." Clara stood frozen in the doorway, the tube containing their salvation gripped tightly in her hand. They had fought for their faith, their family, and their foundation. They had hidden the truth and outsmarted their corporate overseers, only to be caught in the final agonizing moment. Ms. Kincaid's smug face was the living embodiment of their failure. The ultimate choice was upon them: surrender the covenant and lose the house, or refuse and face immediate catastrophic legal repercussions that could destroy the family's reputation and Elias's liberty. The cost of their perseverance was about to become agonizingly high. Clara stood motionless in the foyer, the plastic map tube, the vessel of their survival, hot and slick in her hand. Ms. Kincaid's demand hung in the air, a final, unyielding wall built of legal menace. The corporate lawyer's eyes were narrowed, tracking every minuscule shift in Clara's expression. Elias, standing just behind his daughter, felt the surge of protective instinct, but his deeper conviction forced a different response. He knew that any rash, emotional reaction would be exactly what Omnia's team was hoping for. They were baiting them into an act of desperation. "Ms. Kincaid," Elias said, his voice calm, cutting through the heavy tension. He stepped forward, placing a steady grounding hand on Clara's shoulder. "I understand your mandate as receiver's counsel. However, that tube contains my son's personal school project materials, including a map he drew for a history assignment. It has no bearing on the property's title or value. It is not evidence, it is a child's possession. Ms. Kincaid merely smiled, a cold, predatory flash of teeth. With a multi-million-dollar damages claim pending, Mr. Hawthorne, everything is potential evidence. The court order is explicit. The receiver is authorized to seize anything that could be interpreted as being moved off the property to obstruct the process. You are an interested party who has already displayed a tendency to obscure records, according to our motion filings. Failure to comply immediately with the seizure request will be reported to the court as willful contempt and could result in sanctions against you and your counsel. Hand it over, Miss Hawthorne. Now. Clara looked at her father. Elias's eyes conveyed a complex, agonizing choice. Do not sacrifice your integrity, Clara. We must fight with truth, not technical violations. The temptation to run, to smash the tube, to do anything to protect their secret weapon was overwhelming. But the consequence of contempt, the immediate destruction of Elias's reputation and credibility with the judge, was a price too high to pay. They would be trading a future legal victory for an immediate moral failure. Slowly, deliberately, Clara extended her arm and placed the tube, not into Ms. Kincaid's hand, but onto the antique console table beside her. I am complying with the court order, she stated, her voice steady despite the seismic shift of defeat she felt inside. But I formally protest this seizure as an abuse of the receiver's authority, a clear act of intimidation, and an overreach designed to obstruct our legal defense. Ms. Kincaid ignored the protest, her face radiant with a barely concealed victory. She snatched the tube, unscrewed the cap, and pulled out the tight roll of thick yellowed paper. Her professional mask slipped slightly as her eyes scanned the top line. Deed of Trust and Boundary Settlement, June 12, 1928. The casual victory evaporated, replaced by a sudden, frantic concentration. She quickly retreated to the corner, pulling out her own phone to take multiple high-resolution photos of the document. Her conversation conducted in hushed, urgent tones with Mr. Sterling. The receiver's search had found the silver bullet. Elias walked over to Clara, who felt utterly broken by the surrender. We did the right thing, Clara. We maintained our integrity. They have the document, yes, but we also have the truth. It is now on record in their possession, which means they can no longer claim they weren't aware of it. They will find a way to discredit it, Papa, Clara whispered, tears stinging her eyes. They'll claim it's a forgery, or that its terms were later voided. They will find a loophole. We just gave them weeks of lead time to prepare their defense against our one piece of evidence. Their fear was immediately justified. Ms. Kincaid finished her rapid consultation and approached them, her demeanor now a perfect blend of skepticism and supreme confidence. Mr. Hawthorne, she announced, holding the 1928 covenant disdainfully between two fingers. We have reviewed this document. It appears to be an extremely old informal agreement between two private parties that was likely never officially recorded with the county, or if it was, its terms were clearly superseded by subsequent legal agreements, including the 1955 mineral rights option granted by Mr. Vance's father. She smiled again, a cold, cutting expression. Frankly, we believe this is a pathetic, last-minute forgery meant to distract from your lack of a valid continuous title. Regardless, our title experts will, of course, confirm its absolute worthlessness. The receiver will retain custody of this document as proof of your attempts to mislead the court. The humiliation of being called a liar, of having their great-grandfather's foresight dismissed as a pathetic forgery, was a deep psychological wound. Omnia wasn't just fighting them legally, they were destroying their family's narrative. The next few weeks were a living nightmare of constant intrusive surveillance. Mr. Sterling and his rotating team of auditors, appraisers, and surveyors were a permanent fixture on the property. They cataloged the furniture, inspected the foundation, and drilled core samples until the back end of the property resembled a scarred battlefield. Every conversation Clara and Elias had was conducted in low whispers, or outside, away from the inevitable listening devices they suspected were hidden in the old plaster. The receiver's presence was a continuous, suffocating violation of their privacy and peace. The true corporate attack, however, was launched in the media. Omnia Holdings, through a sophisticated public relations firm, began to control the narrative. A local news report ran a scathing piece that did not name the Hawthorns directly, but described an unnamed family in the countryside ignoring a legitimate court order while living in a derelict structure on corporate land. Then came the direct hit. A popular, nationally syndicated financial commentator, clearly fed a carefully crafted script by Omnia, ran a segment detailing the lawsuit. The commentator, a slick, self-assured man, looked directly into the camera. Omnia Holdings is fighting a necessary battle against stubborn land squatters who refuse to accept modern property laws. This family, led by an elderly gentleman who has apparently been misleading the courts about his finances, is holding up a vital regional development project that would bring hundreds of jobs and millions in tax revenue to the area. They are claiming a ridiculous, decades-old, unrecorded personal letter invalidates all subsequent legal transactions. This is not about justice, it's about a few entitled individuals attempting to hold the entire community hostage for personal gain. Omnia Holdings is merely seeking to clean up a messy old title to proceed with a project that will benefit everyone. Clara watched the segment with Marcus and Sophia. Her hands clenched so tightly her fingernails bit into her palms. The sheer injustice of being branded a land squatter and an obstacle to the community was soul-crushing. Their reputation, which was everything to them as members of their faith community, was being systematically dismantled by lies. "They're making us out to be greedy, selfish people," Sophia whispered, her eyes wide with shock. "How can they lie like that? Everyone in our congregation knows we are not like that." Elias sat down beside her, drawing both children close. "That is their tactic, my dears. They cannot win on the facts, so they try to win on public opinion. They want to make us feel so ashamed, so ostracized that we drop the fight. We must remember who we are. Our integrity is defined by what we know to be true in our hearts and by what our Creator expects of us, not by what a paid commentator says on television." But the smear campaign was working. Elias noticed the subtle glances at the Kingdom Hall, the hesitation in the voices of certain acquaintances. Omnia was isolating them, turning their community into a hostile environment. 2 days later, the emotional pressure took a new, unexpected turn. A certified letter arrived, this one from Mr. Davies. It contained an urgent and disturbing summary of the receiver's latest court filing, a motion for judicial sale. The motion was based on 2 points: the discovery of the valuable mineral deposit confirmed by the core samples, which Mr. Sterling had quietly filed with the court as an Exhibit B, and Omnia's successful use of the media campaign to paint the Hawthorns as uncooperative and irresponsible. Omnia argued that the property, now proven to hold significant mineral wealth, was too valuable to be held hostage by a tenuous title dispute. They requested that the judge order an immediate public auction of the land to secure Omnia's potential $5 million damages judgment, with the house itself to be demolished to allow for immediate excavation access. The shock was absolute. This wasn't a 60-day eviction notice or an asset freeze. This was the guillotine. The motion demanded the sale of their ancestral home within 30 days. "They want to demolish the house," Elias said, the words catching in his throat, the image of his great-grandfather's stone foundation being pulverized by bulldozers, a terrifying vision of finality. Just as the despair threatened to overwhelm them, a small, unmarked envelope arrived in the mail. It had no return address and was postmarked from an anonymous postal box 2 states away. Inside was a single, slightly faded photograph and a cryptic, handwritten note. "Your integrity is your shield. Your weakness is the Thorne family's greatest fear. The 1928 covenant is not Silas Hawthorne's only defense. Look for the original." Water survey. It will confirm why Amos Thorne agreed to the covenant in the first place. The photograph was of a large, complex piece of industrial equipment, taken in black and white, standing on what looked like their property decades ago. It was the same location where the receiver's team was now drilling. The figure standing beside the equipment, though blurry, was clearly the young man from the 1948 photograph, Samuel Vance. The letter was a lifeline, a sign that someone, somewhere, was watching and willing to risk helping them. But who? And what was the original water survey? The Thorne family's greatest fear? Elias looked at the photograph of Samuel Vance standing with the strange drilling equipment near the ancient oak. The equipment wasn't for mining. It looked like a water pump or a geological testing apparatus. They were looking for water, not minerals, Elias realized, the truth dawning on him. Silas Hawthorne's boundary settlement wasn't just about land, it was about something vital to Amos Thorne. And SV was there in the 40s, right before the covenant was challenged. He was doing the work for Amos Thorne's family. Clara felt a sudden, sharp realization. The receiver had found the minerals, but the anonymous note hinted at a vulnerability far more devastating to the Thorne family and Omnia's corporate interests. "Papa," Clara said, pointing at the picture of the water pump, then looking out the window toward the drilling location. "Amos Thorne's land is all uphill from ours. If he needed water, he would have needed an easement through our property. The covenant wasn't just a land restriction, it was a trade. Silas gave him the water access, and in return, Amos restricted the mineral rights in perpetuity. Omnia isn't interested in the minerals. They want to hide the lack of water on the Thorne land, a vulnerability that would destroy the value of their entire development project uphill. The minerals are just a legal cover." The note had revealed the ultimate motive, the true catastrophic secret Omnia was trying to bury. But who was their mysterious helper? The possibility of a sympathetic insider within Omnia, risking everything to expose their corruption, provided a flicker of hope. Yet, the relentless media assault and the looming threat of the judicial sale meant they had less than a month to find a century-old water survey and present it to the judge, all while fighting the receiver's constant scrutiny. The clock was ticking, and the media had already turned the entire community against them. The anonymous note, a lifeline tossed into a raging sea, focused Elias and Clara's efforts with sudden piercing clarity. The judicial sale motion had moved their timeline from months to mere weeks. They had to find the original water survey to expose Omnia's true motive and prove that the mineral rights claim was a cynical smokescreen. The note hinted that the vulnerability was not the Hawthorns, but the Thorne family's greatest fear, a critical, catastrophic lack of water on their adjacent upland land, the very parcel Omnia intended for its luxury development. Elias realized the search couldn't be confined to the house. The documents they needed were likely public records, but hidden in an obsolete or obscure municipal archive deliberately placed outside the scope of modern digital title searches. The mention of the Metropolitan Archives Office stamp on the back of the Samuel Vance photograph from Chapter 1 provided the first geographic clue. Clara, driven by the urgency of the 30-day clock, took the lead on the research. With their assets frozen, they couldn't afford to hire professional researchers. She leveraged her contacts as a schoolteacher, finding an old history professor at a nearby state university who specialized in regional land development and history. She spoke to him in vague terms about a family land dispute, and the professor, intrigued by the mention of the 1928 boundary settlement, pointed her toward the county surveyor's office annex, a notoriously disorganized and dusty repository of paper maps, blueprints, and geological data that predated modern microfilming. The next day, Clara, accompanied by Sophia, who was now an integral part of the defense team, armed with a digital camera and a notebook, drove an hour to the sprawling, neglected annex building. The main office was bright and modern. The annex was a subterranean maze of moldering paper and silent air. They spent the entire day methodically sifting through file drawers filled with brittle, oversized documents, wearing masks to combat the perpetual dust. Clara focused on surveys from the 1910s and 1920s, specifically those bearing the name Amos Thorne, or referencing the major local creek that ran through the Hawthorne property. Sophia, meanwhile, digitally photographed every single water-related document they found, quickly building a searchable archive on her laptop. As the sun began to set, casting long, dusty shadows through the annex's single grimy window, Sophia let out a sharp choke sound of realization. She was looking at a massive hand-drawn blueprint from 1927. "Mom, look at this. It's a hydrological stress test of the Thorne land, commissioned by Amos Thorne just before he signed the covenant with Great-Grandpa Silas," Sophia whispered, her voice tight with excitement. The document was professionally drawn, but the key finding was devastatingly simple. The engineer's report accompanying the map indicated a crucial discovery. The land intended for the current Omnia development was entirely reliant on an underground spring that ran directly through the Hawthorne property. Crucially, the 1927 test showed that the water table was already catastrophically low, and that any major excavation or construction on the Thorn land would likely deplete the water source completely. It's not just a lack of water. Sophia, Clara breathed, tracing the faded lines. It's a structural dependence. Amos Thorne didn't restrict the mineral rights out of charity. He needed Silas Hawthorne to ensure the integrity of the spring. The covenant was a trade, no mining on the Hawthorne land to avoid disturbing the underground water table, in exchange for the certainty of the boundary lines. This proves the 1928 covenant is legitimate and central to the property's value, not just a historical relic. This document was the second silver bullet. It proved Omnia's cover story was a lie. If the public or the court learned that their high-value multi-million-dollar development was on land with a collapsing water source, the value of their entire investment and CEO Vivian Thorne's reputation would instantly plummet. This was the Thorne family's greatest fear. As Clara and Sophia quietly packed the fragile survey, a sudden heavy metallic sound echoed from the far end of the annex. A pair of imposing, clean-cut figures in dark suits emerged from the shadows, their presence utterly out of place in the dusty gloom. They were led by Ms. Kincaid, the Omnia attorney who was supposed to be preoccupied with the judicial sale motion. Ms. Kincaid strode toward them, her eyes blazing with cold professional rage. "I should have known you wouldn't give up your tiresome digging, Ms. Hawthorne," she sneered. "We anticipated you'd look for obsolete municipal records. The receiver's mandate includes safeguarding all potential evidence, and the county surveyor's office annex falls under the scope of public records potentially impacting the property's status. Hand over the documents you just removed from the file." Clara stood firm, placing her body between Miss Kincaid and the desk, where the fragile 1927 blueprint lay. "These documents were never hidden. They are public record, legally accessible by anyone. We haven't removed them. We are legally documenting them. We have not violated the receivership." Ms. Kincaid's voice dropped to a low, menacing hiss. "The court views your constant search for new evidence as an attempt to obstruct proceedings and harass my client. I have come prepared." She pulled a folded document from her jacket, an emergency, ex parte motion for protective order, filed with a friendly judge less than an hour ago, specifically naming the Hawthorne family and their proxies, and restricting their access to any public or private records pertaining to the boundary lines, mineral rights, or water surveys of the Hawthorne and adjacent Thorne properties. Effective immediately, Ms. Kincaid announced, her triumph cold and complete. "You are prohibited from accessing, copying, or using any such document until the judicial sale hearing. This is a court order, Ms. Hawthorne. If you have already copied that survey, you are in violation of a standing protective order. Surrender your daughter's laptop and camera." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. They had the evidence, but Omnia had just sealed it away, using the court system as an extension of their surveillance and intimidation. They had beaten the clock, but they had walked straight into a legal trap. Sophia's laptop held the only digital copy of the 1927 water survey, and surrendering it would mean handing Omnia the very evidence that exposed their fraud. Sophia, standing silently behind her mother, pressed her hands against her backpack, where her laptop was secured. She looked at her mother, her face pale but determined. She thought of her grandfather's quiet resolve, his emphasis on integrity and smart thinking. "The camera is here," Clara said, her voice strained, placing the small digital camera on the table. It contained photos of dozens of irrelevant documents, a perfect decoy. She knew Miss Kincaid wouldn't be satisfied, but it bought them a vital few seconds. Miss Kincaid smirked, taking the camera. "And the laptop, Miss Hawthorne. Don't waste my time." Clara looked at her daughter, an agonizing choice hanging in the balance. As she prepared to respond, ready to protest, but knowing they were beaten, a soft, deliberate cough echoed from the shadows behind Miss Kincaid. A figure emerged, walking slowly into the dim light. It was a man in his mid-50s, impeccably dressed, carrying a slim briefcase. His face was stern, marked by a deep-seated weariness. Ms. Kincaid's triumphant expression shattered instantly, replaced by a look of profound shock and fear. "Mr. Vance, what are you doing here? You should not be—" The man was David Vance, the trusted elder and son of S.V., the man who had given them the conflicting 1955 and 1956 documents. But this wasn't the same David Vance from the woodworking shop. This man was wearing a bespoke suit, and he radiated a quiet authority. He held a slim, high-end satellite phone, clearly indicating a deep, unsettling connection to the corporate world that was trying to ruin them. David Vance ignored Ms. Kincaid's flustered interruption. He looked directly at Clara and Sophia, his eyes filled with a weary mix of guilt and resolve. "Miss Hawthorne," David said, his voice quiet but commanding, "I believe you are looking for this." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine photocopied documents. "This is the complete due diligence file on the Hawthorne property and the adjacent Thorne parcel, prepared for Omnia Holdings Group's executive board. It contains internal memos discussing the intentional concealment of the 1928 covenant and the catastrophic 1927 water survey." He turned to Ms. Kincaid, his face a mask of deep self-loathing conviction. "I may not have known my father's complete story, but I know mine. My father regretted his moral lapse until the day he died. I will not repeat his mistake. I am an executive director of Ethelred Acquisitions, the shell company Omnia bought. I have been fighting them internally for months, trying to force a disclosure of the 1927 report. When Omnia launched the judicial sale, I knew I had run out of time." He looked back at the stunned Hawthorns, a profound confession hanging in the silent room. "I was the anonymous source. I sent the note. And the only way I could get this information to you was by resigning my position an hour ago and violating every non-disclosure agreement I ever signed. I am exposing their corporate fraud from the inside, a moral choice over my professional life. This information, combined with your 1928 covenant, proves their malicious intent." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Ms. Kincaid is here because Omnia is not relying on the judge's protective order. They are relying on my betrayal. They suspected my involvement, and they have been tracking my phone. Ms. Kincaid knows I am meeting you. The question is, Ms. Hawthorne, why did you not come to me sooner? Your lack of immediate trust has cost us valuable time, and now Omnia is ready to file their next most devastating move. They're not just trying to buy the land, they're trying to discredit the moral character of your family in the media, a direct attack on your faith and community standing. And I am afraid I may have played a small part in providing them with the ammunition they need." David Vance's astonishing confession and internal documents were the ultimate breakthrough, validating their greatest suspicions. Yet, his final, guilt-ridden revelation, that Omnia was preparing a direct personal attack on their character, was the chilling cliffhanger, proving that the legal fight was about to descend into a dirty public morality war that could cost them more than just their house. The betrayal had come, but not from the man they feared. It had come from within Omnia's ranks, through the son of the very man who had caused the original flaw, a betrayal of integrity that David was now trying desperately to rectify. The revelation of David Vance's role, the son of the man who created the original flaw, now risking everything to expose the corporate conspiracy, was a shockwave that changed the entire dynamic of the fight. David's profound moral commitment to rectify his father's historical mistake, even at the cost of his own career and potentially his freedom, was a testament to the power of a clear conscience. But his final warning, that Omnia was about to launch a character assassination campaign, sent a chill down Clara's spine. Clara, Elias, and David immediately retreated to Mr. Davies's office, the weight of the new evidence and the chilling threat of Omnia's next move pressing on them. David laid out the thick stack of internal Omnia documents, memos, legal opinions, and the full due diligence report on the conference table. The contents were explosive, proving not only that Omnia was fully aware of the binding 1928 covenant and the catastrophic 1927 water survey, but that they had actively conspired to conceal the evidence, fabricate the mineral claim, and use the legal system to coerce the Hawthorns. The file contained an internal legal brief titled "Mitigating Water Risk and Eliminating Surface Obstruction, Hawthorne Parcel." Mr. Davies, his professional pessimism finally replaced by a grim determination, stared at the file. "This is it," he announced, his voice hushed with the magnitude of the discovery. "This is not merely a title dispute. This is clear evidence of corporate fraud and obstruction of justice. We can file a devastating motion for a temporary injunction to halt the judicial sale, citing this new evidence and demanding a full investigation into Omnia's deceptive practices and malicious intent." Just as they were organizing the documents, Mr. Davies' secretary rushed in, her face white with alarm. She placed a stack of glossy, full-color pamphlets on the table. "Mr. Hawthorne, Ms. Hawthorne, these were just delivered to the office. They're being distributed all over the neighborhood and around the Kingdom Hall." The pamphlet's cover was a professionally designed, shocking collage. A grainy, highly unflattering photo of the old Hawthorne house juxtaposed with a gleaming rendering of Omnia's proposed luxury development. The headline, printed in bold accusatory font, screamed, "The high cost of selfishness. Are 2 generations of unprincipled land claims destroying our community's future?" The text inside was a masterpiece of vicious insinuation. It detailed the pending $5 million damages suit, claiming that Elias was attempting to hide assets and force the community to bear the cost of his obstructionist litigation. But the true malignancy was the personal attack. The pamphlet suggested that the Hawthorne family's fight was driven by greed, claiming they were secretly leveraging the mineral rights for personal gain, while hypocritically posing as people of high moral character. It subtly but unmistakably targeted their spiritual life, implying that their actions were a direct contradiction of the values they publicly espoused. The pamphlet concluded with a chilling call to action, urging concerned neighbors to contact the local judge and demand the immediate judicial sale. Clara felt a profound wave of nausea. This was the promised attack, not on the legal documents, but on their moral identity. Omnia was weaponizing public opinion, turning their beloved community into an instrument of persecution. The attack was specifically designed to humiliate them among the only group of people who had been supporting them, their spiritual brothers and sisters. "They are hitting us where it hurts the most," Elias said, his voice a low rumble of pain. "They are trying to strip us of our good name. They want us to feel so much shame that we will sign anything to make the public spectacle end." David Vance looked at the pamphlet with a deep, crushing self-reproach. "I am so sorry. I told Ms. Kincaid in a moment of frustration that the Hawthorns' reputation in their community was paramount to them. I never thought I am the reason they chose this specific, cruel attack." "Your integrity now outweighs any mistake you made, David," Elias assured him, refusing to let the guilt consume the man who had risked everything to help them. "We must face this as we face every challenge, with dignity and truth. We will not respond with anger or counter-slander. We will respond with the facts." Mr. Davies immediately filed an emergency motion to hold Omnia in contempt for jury tampering and public coercion, but he knew the damage was already done. The insidious poison of suspicion spreads faster than the antidote of truth. The first court hearing, a formality to review the receiver's motion for judicial sale, arrived like a death sentence. The atmosphere in the courtroom was charged. The courtroom was packed, not just with Omnia's well-paid legal team, but also with dozens of concerned citizens, many of whom were Omnia's own employees or people swayed by the relentless media campaign. Ms. Kincaid wore a self-satisfied smirk. The judge, a man known for his procedural strictness, entered, and the proceedings began. Mr. Sterling, the temporary receiver, took the stand first, painting a picture of an uncooperative, reckless family whose negligence threatened the value of the property and justified the immediate sale and demolition. Ms. Kincaid then presented the case for the judicial sale, citing the mineral wealth, the uncooperative owners, and the manufactured public interest as reasons for expediency. When it was time for the Hawthorns' defense, Elias took the stand. He was calm, articulate, and unwavering. He spoke not just of legal points, but of the moral history of the land, the integrity of his great-grandfather, and the sanctity of the home. Mr. Davies then tried to introduce the 1928 covenant, arguing it fundamentally invalidated Omnia's entire claim. But Ms. Kincaid immediately objected. Your Honor, Ms. Kincaid stated with a dismissive wave of her hand. The defense's alleged covenant is a simple, unrecorded private agreement that is, at best, superseded. We request that the court move to the main issue, the fact that this family has failed to pay the security required for the $5 million damages claim and continues to obstruct the receiver's efforts to liquidate the asset for the benefit of the community. The judge looked at Elias with a mixture of skepticism and pity. Mr. Hawthorne, with all due respect, your counsel has not yet provided substantial certified documentation to prove the validity of this century-old agreement. The court cannot stop a judicial sale motion on the basis of a private, potentially defunct, handwritten document. The judge's decision was swift and devastating. He denied the motion to halt the judicial sale, finding that Omnia's claim of unrecoverable damages and the receiver's evidence of mineral wealth warranted proceeding. The judicial sale will proceed as scheduled in 3 weeks, the judge declared. I will grant a final hearing 1 week before the sale to review any certified documentation that definitively refutes the ownership claim, but until then, the asset remains under the receiver's control. Elias and Clara felt the air leave their lungs. They had the truth, they had the documents, and they had David Vance's internal memos, but they had just been humiliated in open court and lost the first crucial battle. Omnia's strategy had worked. They had successfully used the judicial sale motion and the media campaign to create an insurmountable legal momentum. As the Hawthorne family quietly left the courtroom, walking past the hostile pamphlet-wielding crowd, their morale was at its lowest ebb. They had lost the first battle, and the sale of their home was now imminent. The shame from the public attack, combined with the legal setback, was almost too much to bear. That evening, a somber meeting took place in the Hawthorne living room. Elias, Clara, Marcus, Sophia, and Mr. Davies sat together, surrounded by the silence of a house they were about to lose. The betrayal of the community fostered by Omnia's lies felt worse than the legal defeat itself. We have the truth, Elias murmured, holding the internal Omnia documents. But we don't have the proof of validity the judge demands for the 1928 covenant. We need something to link that document to a public, indisputable record, something that proves it wasn't just a private handshake, but a legally binding arrangement. Clara, her eyes red from strain, looked at the one piece of evidence David Vance had risked everything to provide, the internal memo on the mitigating water risk strategy. She focused on one small technical detail buried in the document. Look at this, Papa. Omnia's legal team identified a major flaw in the 1928 covenant. It stipulated that any challenge to the mineral rights was to be mediated by the Township Water Resources Authority, TWRA, whose archive is where the original water survey was found. The TWRA, Elias repeated, a flicker of light in his eyes. That's why the covenant is valid. It named a specific public body for enforcement. But the TWRA was dissolved in the 1960s. The TWRA archive, Clara finished, a sudden, desperate thought forming in her mind. It might hold the original certified copy of the 1928 covenant, filed with them for mediation purposes, right alongside the 1927 water survey. The county records failed us, but the Water Authority archive might not have. The realization was a sudden, desperate jolt of energy. They had lost the day, but the fight was not over. They had 1 week. The challenge was monumental, finding an archive for a defunct government body and locating a single century-old document that the most powerful corporation in the region had spent months trying to bury. But if they succeeded, the evidence, now certified and irrefutable, would not only save their home but also expose Omnia's malice, justifying a powerful new counterclaim that could finally bring justice. Elias knew with a certainty that settled his soul that the answer was hidden in the forgotten filing cabinet of a long-dead public servant. They had to find it before the final judgment was rendered. The devastating loss in the preliminary hearing, combined with the shame of the public smear campaign, had created a crucible of emotional tension in the Hawthorne home. Yet, in the silent aftermath, the family's moral compass steadied. They had been humiliated and defeated on the facts presented, but the truth was still hidden, waiting to be unearthed. The revelation that the validity of the 1928 covenant hinged on the archives of the defunct Township Water Resources Authority, and TWRA, gave them a desperate final target. They had 1 week until the final presale hearing. Elias, despite the heavy toll of the day's events, could not rest. His mind was already mapping out the geography of the past. A defunct government body doesn't simply vanish, he stated that night, pacing the length of the worn Persian rug. Its records must be absorbed by a successor agency, likely one with a dull, bureaucratic name. We need to find out which entity took over the TWRA's water management portfolio in the 1960s. Clara immediately initiated a flurry of calls, navigating the frustrating labyrinth of regional government bureaucracy. The corporate world was efficient. The world of forgotten municipal archives was maddeningly slow. Her inquiries eventually led her to an elderly, semi-retired civil engineer who remembered the organizational shuffle decades ago. The TWRA's historical archives, he revealed, were not with the county or the state, but had been relegated to the basement of the Regional Road Maintenance Depot, a sprawling cinder-block complex located 20 miles outside the nearest town, notorious for its disorganization and lack of climate control. The next morning, while Mr. Davies prepared the emergency motion based on the explosive internal documents provided by David Vance, which, crucially, still lacked the certified proof the judge demanded, Elias, Clara, and Marcus drove to the maintenance depot. Marcus's youthful energy and aptitude for digital organization were now essential. Sophia stayed home to manage the house under the watchful, hostile eye of the temporary receivers team. The depot's foreman, a grizzled, indifferent man, pointed them toward a single unmarked metal door in the deepest, dustiest corner of the basement. "All that water authority junk is down there," he grumbled, handing them a flashlight. "Haven't seen daylight in 30 years. Just don't touch the asbestos." The basement was a shock. A low-ceilinged cavern of forgotten history, thick with the smell of damp concrete and decay. Water trickled audibly somewhere in the distance. The archives were not stored in file cabinets, but stacked haphazardly in enormous unstable piles of mildewed cardboard boxes, interspersed with discarded road signs, rusted tools, and broken snowplows. It was a perfect physical representation of buried truth. "This is impossible," Clara whispered, staring at the sheer volume of material. "We have a week. This could take a year." "We will apply focus," Elias said, already moving toward the first stack. He refused to be overwhelmed. "We are looking for 3 things: the TWRA accession logs, any box labeled Boundary Disputes 1920, 1930, and, most specifically, the name Amos Thorne or Silas Hawthorne." They began the excruciating work, Elias and Clara systematically opening and discarding boxes of irrelevant documents, old bridge specifications, traffic flow patterns from the 1950s, minutes from long-forgotten town hall meetings. Marcus, using the forensic digital skills he developed, cross-referenced the few surviving TWRA index cards they found with the dates and names on the internal Omnia documents, looking for any link. Hours bled into one another. The light from their flashlight beams seemed to sink into the heavy air. Frustration mounted. They found nothing specific, only endless paper trails leading to dead ends. Elias paused, running a hand over his face, the emotional toll of the week finally threatening to break his composure. Was this a fool's errand? Had Omnia been right to assume this kind of evidence could never be found? He remembered David Vance's face, a man who sacrificed his career for their sake. He remembered his great-grandfather Silas, who had protected this land with foresight and integrity. He reached deeper into his faith, praying silently for direction and strength. He noticed a stack of oversized tube-shaped containers near a large water heater, almost hidden by a stack of defunct yield signs. They were the kind of heavy cardboard cylinders used for storing architectural blueprints and large maps. "Marcus, Clara, over here," he called, his voice rough. They carefully pulled the tubes out. They were unmarked, sealed with brittle masking tape. Using a small penknife, Elias carefully cut the tape on the third tube. Inside, tightly rolled and protected from the worst of the decay by the heavy cardboard, were dozens of ancient brittle vellum blueprints. Marcus carefully began to unroll the top blueprint. It was a detailed hand-drawn map. The title in bold faded ink read, Topographical and Hydrological Survey, Thorn and Hawthorne Properties, 1927. "We have the water survey," Clara exclaimed, relief and exhaustion battling for dominance in her voice. But Elias was looking at the reverse side, where a large circular stamp was visible. It was the official seal of the Township Water Resources Authority. The survey itself was now certified and indisputable. It confirmed the critical water dependency of the Thornland, the very vulnerability Omnia was hiding. As they began to roll up the survey, Marcus saw a small separate folder tucked into the bottom of the tube. It was labeled in an elegant spidery hand. Settlement Stipulations, Hawthorne Thorn Dispute. Inside was the ultimate prize, a perfectly preserved multi-page document. It was the original 1928 Deed of Trust and Boundary Settlement, the very document Elias had found in the attic. But this copy was different. It was signed by Silas Hawthorne and Amos Thorne, witnessed by the township administrator, and most importantly on the final page, a section was signed and dated by the TWRA's chief legal counsel, attesting that the covenant concerning mineral rights was fully enforceable and perpetually binding under the authority of the township's public works statutes. It explicitly stated that the purpose was to ensure the long-term water supply for the region. This was the smoking gun. It validated their private copy of the covenant, transformed it into an unassailable public record, and proved Omnia's primary claim that the document was informal and superseded, a calculated lie. "We did it," Clara whispered, tears of profound relief streaming down her face. "Papa, we found the certified proof. Omnia can't challenge the validity of this." "Not only that," Elias said, his voice quiet with the awe of divine providence. "This document doesn't just save our house, it is a public record confirming the central lie of Omnia's entire development project. This allows us to move beyond a simple title dispute and expose the corporate fraud and reckless disregard for public resources." But as they gathered the invaluable documents, preparing to race back to Mr. Davies, the silence of the massive, cold basement was broken by the grating sound of the metal door being dragged open above them. A tall figure appeared at the top of the steep concrete steps, backlit by the single weak fluorescent bulb in the maintenance area. It was Mr. Sterling, the temporary receiver, dressed not in his business suit, but in rugged work clothes, carrying a heavy-duty commercial-grade portable scanner. His face was set in an expression of cold, utter certainty. "I had a suspicion you'd waste your time digging through the refuse, Mr. Hawthorne," Sterling said, his voice echoing in the concrete space. "Miss Kincaid informed me of your daughter's inquiries into the TWRA, a defunct archive and unorganized collection. It's a perfect place to hide the truth, or for me to conduct a final mandated inventory of property-related documents, which naturally includes public records relevant to the asset's title." He descended the stairs slowly, his eyes fixed on the documents in Elias's hand. "You've just confirmed the validity of the covenant for me, Mr. Hawthorne. Thank you. Now I will seize that certified document, file it with the court as an exhibit in the receivership inventory, and Omnia will have a week to prepare their argument that the TWRA's authority was voided in the 1960s. AIE, much easier argument to make than challenging the document's very existence." The realization hit Elias like a physical blow. Sterling wasn't just working for Omnia, he was an expert strategist, anticipating their every move, using the letter of the law, the receivership, to seize their evidence before they could use it as a weapon. They had come so far only to be cornered again, this time literally in a damp, forgotten basement. Sterling was 10 feet away, closing the distance. "Hand over the certified documents, Mr. Hawthorne. Do not force me to use physical means. We can do this with the dignity your lawyer insists you possess." Elias looked at his son, his eyes conveying the profound moral risk of the moment. They could comply and give Omnia the week they needed to neutralize the evidence, or they could make a stand. Integrity demanded compliance, but the impending destruction of their home demanded action. There had to be a way to transmit the truth without physical confrontation. Marcus, standing behind his father, looked down at his phone. The basement was notorious for poor reception. No signal. He realized their only chance was to turn the environmental disaster of the archive into a tactical advantage. The water heater beside them was an old industrial model, its piping a complex maze. Marcus suddenly yelled, "Dad, look out!" He grabbed a rusted iron rod from the debris, swinging it not at Sterling but at an old corroded pipe near the floor, a pipe clearly marked with a faded Tora tag. The pipe burst with a sickening screech of rusted metal, sending a powerful jet of foul, archive-contaminated water shooting directly across the floor. Sterling, startled, recoiled instantly, dropping his high-tech scanner as the pressurized water soaked his work clothes and the documents he carried. "Contempt!" he roared, spitting water. "You've just violated a court order and destroyed government property." "My son tripped and reacted to the danger," Elias countered, his voice booming in the confined space, seizing the moral high ground. "We were evacuating the area due to dangerous conditions, Mr. Sterling. If you attempt to seize our personal belongings now, I will file a police report for assault and obstruction." With the floor slick and the air filled with mist, Marcus grabbed the map tube and the document folder and bolted for the stairs, Clara and Elias immediately following. They left Mr. Sterling sputtering in the midst of the broken pipe, momentarily defeated by the chaos. They drove straight to Mr. Davies's office, soaked and smelling of mold. Mr. Davies, upon seeing the certified 1928 document and the 1927 survey, wept openly. "This is it, Elias. We have them," he announced, immediately drafting a massive motion for dismissal and counterclaim, including all of David Vance's internal memos, the newly certified documents, and a detailed complaint outlining Omnia's deliberate malicious scheme and obstruction of justice. The documents were filed that night with the court clerk, just hours before the judge was set to review the judicial sale motion. The tide had turned. But as Elias finally allowed himself to feel a measure of hope, Mr. Davies received a frantic call. "Elias," Mr. Davies stammered, his face pale, "Mr. Sterling just filed an emergency motion. He's alleging assault, destruction of property, and a felony charge of aggravated obstruction of justice against you and Marcus. He included a sworn affidavit stating you orchestrated the pipe bursting to destroy evidence. The judge has issued a warrant for Marcus's arrest." The victory of finding the truth was instantly overshadowed by a terrifying new reality. Omnia was no longer trying to take their house. They were trying to put their son in jail, using a distorted legal charge as the ultimate act of intimidation. Their final week of freedom had just begun with the most devastating threat imaginable. The world of the Hawthorne family had contracted to the four walls of their house, a temporary sanctuary under siege. The judicial threat of the imminent sale had been amplified tenfold by the arrest warrant issued for Marcus. This was the ultimate corporate brutality, attacking their child to break the resolve of the parents. Elias immediately contacted Mr. Davies, who, though shaken, was already working on an emergency motion to quash the warrant. "Elias, Clara, listen closely." Mr. Davies's voice was tight over the phone. "This is calculated malice. Mr. Sterling and Ms. Kincaid have framed Marcus's action in the basement as a premeditated felony to destroy evidence. I'm arguing that it was a spontaneous reaction to a dangerous, wet environment, an act of self-defense against Mr. Sterling's seizure attempt. But until the judge reviews our motion, Marcus cannot stay home. We cannot risk a physical arrest, which would be a PR victory for Omnia. He needs to leave immediately, quietly, and stay with a trusted friend outside the jurisdiction of the local police until the warrant is addressed." The conversation that followed with Marcus and Sophia was agonizing. Elias and Clara explained the severity of the charge and the necessity of immediate temporary flight. Marcus, though frightened, understood the gravity of the situation and the necessity of protecting the family's integrity. He was driven to the home of a close, trusted spiritual brother an hour away. forced to leave his home and his family behind because he had acted to save their truth. With Marcus gone, the silence in the house was profound, heavy with fear and separation. The separation was exactly what Omnia desired, a psychological blow designed to fracture the family's unity. Later that afternoon, the second, more subtle stage of Omnia's pressure arrived. Ms. Kincaid appeared at the front door, this time not with legal papers, but with a simple, sealed, unaddressed envelope and a chillingly placid demeanor. Mr. Sterling stood 10 feet. Behind her, his arms crossed, a clear threat. "Miss Hawthorne, Mr. Hawthorne," she began, her tone shifting from aggression to a smooth, oily persuasiveness. "Omnia Holdings has reviewed the documents you filed this morning, the certified 1928 covenant, the 1927 water survey, and, regrettably, the internal documents provided by Mr. Vance, whom we are now pursuing for gross breaches of contract." She paused, allowing the gravity of the implied threat against David Vance to settle. "We acknowledge that the certified covenant complicates the immediate title dispute. You have, against all odds, found a flaw in our legal strategy regarding the house itself. However, the complexity of the mineral rights and the validity of the covenant in a post-1960s legal environment will still result in years of financially crippling litigation, far exceeding your frozen assets." She pushed the unaddressed envelope toward Clara. "Omnia Holdings is prepared to offer a final, non-negotiable settlement." Elias looked at the envelope with profound suspicion. "We have proof of corporate fraud and obstruction of justice. We have evidence that your entire development is based on a lie about the water source. Why would you offer a settlement now, unless you are desperate to bury this truth?" Ms. Kincaid's smile was chillingly confident. "Because litigation, even when victorious, is messy and expensive, Mr. Hawthorne. And while your documents prove the covenant's existence, they do not erase the reality of the mineral rights option, nor do they absolve your son of the felony charge now pending. We can fight you on the covenant, but we believe a resolution is beneficial to both parties." She explained the terms, which were a devastating exercise in calculated division. Omnia offered $5 million, the exact amount of the damages they were suing for, to buy the property and all associated rights, provided the Hawthorns immediately sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, NDA, forbidding them from ever speaking about the 1927 water survey, the 1928 covenant, the mineral rights, or David Vance's internal documents. "This is the crucial part, Mr. Hawthorne," she continued, her voice dropping. "Upon signature of the settlement, Omnia will immediately issue a statement to the press and the court affirming that the obstruction of justice charge against your son Marcus was based on an unfortunate miscommunication with the temporary receiver, and will immediately file a motion to vacate the arrest warrant. Marcus will be free, his record clean. Furthermore, we will drop the $5 million damages suit against you entirely, securing your remaining frozen assets." The terms were a moral firestorm. They were being offered their financial freedom, the restoration of their reputation, and, most agonizingly, the immediate safety and liberty of their son. The price was their silence, the ultimate act of moral compromise. They would allow Omnia to bury the truth about the water scandal, putting an entire community at risk for the corporation's profit, all to save their son from persecution. Ms. Kincaid watched them, the calculation of their pain evident in her eyes. "You have 24 hours, Mr. Hawthorne. Settle, save your son, and walk away with dignity. Or fight, expose the truth, lose the house eventually, and watch your son face a felony conviction." She turned and left, leaving Elias and Clara alone with the unaddressed envelope and the profound moral abyss it represented. Clara picked up the envelope, her hand trembling. "Papa, we can't lose Marcus. A felony charge. It would ruin his future, his opportunities to serve. This is what Omnia knew would break us. They are not asking for the house. They are asking for our integrity, our principle of standing up for what is right." Elias walked to the window, staring out at the drilling equipment silently poised on their ancestral land. He thought of the scripture that spoke of preferring a good name over great riches, and of the need to do what is just, even when the heavens seem to fall. They have given us a devil's bargain, Clara, he said, his voice quiet but filled with a deep internal struggle. They are using Marcus as a shield to protect their corporate crime. If we sign that NDA, we are complicit in the intentional deceit of an entire region about their water security. We are betraying David Vance, who risked everything for us. We are proving the media campaign right, that we are selfish individuals who value personal comfort over public good and moral truth. Clara knew he was right, but the image of Marcus in a courtroom stripped of his dignity was unbearable. But if we don't sign, Papa, how can we ask Marcus to sacrifice his future for our fight? We made a decision to stand for the truth, but we cannot ask our son to bear the sole consequence of that stand. The division was deep and painful. Elias believed they must trust that the same integrity that guided them would protect their son, even through the legal fire. Clara believed that a parent's duty to protect their child's immediate well-being and future superseded the fight for a greater abstract truth. Just as the argument reached its agonizing height, the front door opened, and Sophia walked in from the kitchen, where she had been watching a nature documentary on her phone, which had a surprisingly sensitive microphone. Her face was pale. "Mom, Papa, I heard everything," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear and resolve. "You can't take the settlement. You have to save the water. Grandpa, you taught us that integrity means telling the truth when it costs you everything. If Omnia gets away with lying about the water, people will suffer, and Marcus wouldn't want that. He saved the covenant because he knew what was right. If you sell out now, his sacrifice, my sacrifice in the archives, it all means nothing." She walked over to the envelope, picked it up, and placed it back on the table, distancing herself from the compromise. "Call Mr. Davies. Tell him you will not sign. Tell him to use David Vance's documents and the certified covenant to fight the judicial sale and to fight the arrest warrant on principle. We are a family. We stand together. We will trust in justice and our integrity." Elias looked at his youngest daughter, seeing in her youthful face the fierce, clear reflection of the very values he had taught her. She had become the moral anchor he needed. He looked at Clara, who finally nodded, the fight returning to her eyes, the mother's fear subsumed by the necessity of moral courage. "We fight," Clara stated, her voice firm. "We trust that the same judge who issued the warrant will be compelled by the evidence of Omnia's greater crime. We will not be blackmailed into moral failure." Elias took a deep breath, picking up the settlement offer. He walked over to the stone fireplace, its chimney a sentinel against the corporate storm. He held the envelope over the small dying embers. The heat curled the glossy paper. "This is not a bargain," Elias declared, his voice a steady vow. "It is the final test of our resolve." He released the envelope. It fell onto the embers, catching fire instantly, turning into a plume of ash, a defiant rejection of the corporate coercion. But as the ashes settled, Elias's phone, which he had placed on the mantelpiece, vibrated with an incoming call from an unknown block number. He answered it, the line immediately crackling with static. A voice, high-pitched and disguised electronically, spoke 3 words. "The second betrayal." The line disconnected. Elias stared at the phone, his heart sinking with a new, icy fear. The rejected settlement offer had been the final test of their integrity. Now, a threat of a second betrayal, one they hadn't anticipated, meant the enemy was still closer than they thought, embedded in a layer of trust they had not yet scrutinized. Had someone else close to them compromised their position, or had the entire crisis begun with a deeper, more personal deception? The battle for the house was not just against Omnia, it was against a hidden enemy within their own sphere. The cryptic, electronically disguised voice on the phone, "the second betrayal," shattered the momentary triumph of rejecting Omnia's settlement. The family's relief over their moral stand instantly curdled into fresh, icy fear. The rejected bargain had forced the enemy to play their final, hidden card. The threat of an insider, a hidden weakness they hadn't yet identified. Elias, Clara, and Mr. Davies met immediately to dissect the implications of the threat. The obvious potential betrayer, David Vance, had already proven his integrity at great personal cost. They had to look deeper, closer, within their own sphere of influence. The phone call was clearly timed to coincide with the rejection of the settlement, Mr. Davies analyzed, running a weary hand through his hair. Omnia's legal team is sophisticated. They wouldn't rely on a simple threat unless they had something actionable. The first betrayal was SV's in 1955, which created the legal flaw. This second betrayal must be a modern one, someone feeding Omnia information that allows them to anticipate our moves and target our vulnerabilities. They systematically reviewed the small circle of people privy to their most sensitive defense strategies. 1. David Vance, ruled out. His resignation and the handover of internal documents was a risk that confirmed his loyalty to justice. 2. Mr. Davies's staff. Highly unlikely, given the small, trusted nature of the local firm. 3. The Hawthorne family. An unthinkable possibility, but the children were the only ones aware of certain crucial details, like the location of the covenant in the attic, and Marcus's specific action in the archives. Clara thought of the relentless media campaign, the pamphlets that attacked their moral standing. The person who spoke to Omnia's PR team knew how much our reputation in the community meant to us. David admitted he mentioned it, but was there someone else who spoke about our private life, our spiritual values, our commitment to the house? Someone who Omnia might have pressured or paid? Elias was quiet, his eyes distant, searching the past and the present. He realized the most vulnerable spot in their circle wasn't legal or financial, it was personal trust. The only other person who knew about the true depths of the legal threat, the children's involvement, and the emotional stakes, and who was not involved in the legal strategy sessions, was a family friend, someone we confided in, seeking support and prayer during this trial. Clara's mind immediately leaped to Eleanor Vane, a longtime trusted family friend and a member of their congregation. Eleanor was a woman of seemingly impeccable character, a widow who had been a constant source of quiet encouragement and small practical acts of support throughout the crisis. Clara had often shared her deepest fears with Eleanor during long, emotional phone calls. Eleanor, Clara whispered, the name tasting like ash. She knows everything. I told her about the asset freeze, about the shame of the media coverage, even about how terrified we were for Marcus when the warrant was issued. She was the one I cried to after the first court loss. The suspicion felt like a toxic invasion of the deepest part of their life. Elias, however, needed more than suspicion. We cannot accuse a friend without proof, Clara, especially not a spiritual sister. We must find evidence that she has been compromised or misled. Elias remembered an odd detail from the past few weeks. Eleanor had insisted on bringing over meals, but always arrived unannounced, often lingering near Elias's old mahogany desk, which held his private papers. Elias had dismissed it as well-meaning fussiness. Now it looked like surveillance. They had to set a trap. They needed to plant a false piece of information, a fabricated next move, and see if Omnia immediately responded to it. The high stakes of the impending final hearing demanded a high-risk gamble. Elias came up with a plan that leveraged the emotional pressure Omnia had applied. The core issue now is the judicial sale and the arrest warrant for Marcus. Omnia believes we will do anything to protect him. We will use that. Clara called Eleanor, her voice carefully modulated to sound strained and panicked, yet resolute. Eleanor, I need your prayers. We've decided our only option is to expose Omnia's corruption to the media before the hearing. We are going to hold a press conference tomorrow morning, right here on the property, and release all of David Vance's internal documents, including the 1927 water survey, to the major news networks. We hope that the public outrage will force the judge to quash the warrant and halt the sale. It's a huge risk, but it's our only choice. She stressed the timing and the location, making it sound like an irreversible, desperate act. Eleanor, on the other end, offered a flurry of soothing, comforting words, urging caution but praising their courage. The trap was set. The family spent the rest of the evening in agonizing suspense. They waited. They prayed. They monitored the news, looking for any mention of a pending press conference. Nothing appeared. But at 2 a.m., the quiet of the night was brutally violated. Two large, unmarked construction flatbed trucks, accompanied by Mr. Sterling's black SUV, rumbled up the Hawthorne driveway. The vehicles stopped directly in front of the house. Out stepped a crew of men in hard hats and the ever-present sneering figure of Mr. Sterling. Elias and Clara, who had been waiting, watched from an upstairs window. They didn't counter with media, Clara breathed, her hand gripping the curtain. They countered with physical force. Mr. Sterling strode to the center of the lawn and barked orders. The men immediately began to unload massive concrete barricades and high industrial-grade chain-link fencing. They were erecting a security perimeter, isolating the house from the press and the public before the alleged morning press conference. More sinisterly, one truck was deploying a large specialized earth-moving drill, not for core samples, but for immediate excavation. Mr. Sterling yelled into his radio, his voice clearly audible even from the house. The Hawthorne family is attempting to release confidential and fabricated corporate materials to the media tomorrow. Per the emergency order of the receiver, we are securing the perimeter and preparing to initiate preemptive site access to prevent further obstruction of the asset's development. Omnia had moved to physically seal the property and initiate destructive work, all based on the false information about the press conference. They acted so fast, so decisively that the only explanation was a direct, immediate tip from a trusted source. Clara's phone buzzed with a message, a text from Sophia, who was hiding in the kitchen, observing the invaders. It was a photo of the flatbed truck's manifest, which a worker had carelessly dropped. The manifest listed the items being delivered along with the contact name for the emergency order, Eleanor Vane. The second betrayal was confirmed, and it was devastatingly personal. Eleanor Vane had a private catering business, and her name had been used by Omnia's logistics team, likely without her full knowledge, to hastily secure the trucks and equipment under the guise of an urgent site preparation job. They had leveraged her small local business and her family connection to gain immediate, unquestioned access to the necessary resources for their nighttime maneuver. "Papa," Clara whispered, the betrayal burning away her last vestige of doubt. It wasn't just information she gave them. They used her small business as a front for their corporate invasion. Omnia leveraged her loyalty and her business connections to expedite this attack. They knew we wouldn't suspect Eleanor Vane's catering delivery truck showing up at 2 a.m. Elias watched the fence posts being driven into the ground, sealing them in. They thought we would simply wait until morning, paralyzed by the sight of the fence. They have underestimated the power of truth. He grabbed his phone and called Mr. Davies, instructing him to use the internal documents to file an immediate emergency motion for discovery regarding the logistics manifest of the delivery vehicles on the property, naming Omnia's use of a trusted local name as a front. Then Elias walked downstairs. He looked at the chaos unfolding on his lawn, the metallic screech of the fence being erected. He opened the front door and walked out onto the porch, his pajamas a stark contrast to the hard hat workers. Mr. Sterling looked up, startled. "Mr. Hawthorne, you are not permitted outside the residence during this operation. Return inside, or I will authorize the security team to remove you." Elias ignored him. He looked past Sterling directly at the heavy excavation drill that was now positioning itself near the ancient oak, the area where the 1928 covenant protected the water source. "You have been betrayed, Mr. Sterling," Elias called out, his voice clear and resonant in the dark. "You are acting on fraudulent information provided by a desperate corporate structure. Your goal is to cover up a decades-old crime." Suddenly a voice echoed from the dark perimeter of the property, startling both Elias and the Omnia crew. "Mr. Hawthorne is right." A figure stepped forward from the shadows. It was David Vance standing beside his own small work pickup truck, which was pulling a low-slung trailer. "I found out about Omnia's plan to use local vendors, including Eleanor Vane, to execute this illegal night maneuver," David called out, addressing the air. "Startled workers and Mr. Sterling. I am here tonight to ensure no further crimes are committed. I am a former executive director of the parent company, and I have evidence that this is a criminal act of corporate vandalism based on a fabricated legal claim. This is the truth." David opened his truck bed, revealing what he was hauling on the trailer. A massive, ornate, hand-carved stone. It was the original Hawthorne boundary marker, placed by Silas Hawthorne in 1918, a piece of irrefutable physical evidence that matched the 1928 covenant. As Elias stood firm on the porch, his own moral clarity a shield against the corporate invasion, he knew the battle was now public, physical, and agonizingly personal. The final legal hearing was only days away, but Omnia was attempting to preempt the entire judicial process by destroying the property before the judge could rule. David Vance's physical presence and loud, honest testimony was the last piece of their defense. The second betrayal had been leveraged for a final, desperate physical attack, but it had brought their most powerful ally into the field of battle. The dawn of the final hearing was about to break, and the war was now on their front lawn. The pre-dawn scene on the Hawthorne property was a tableau of confrontation. Elias, a silhouette of unwavering resolve on the porch. David Vance standing beside his truck, his integrity physically manifested in the ancient stone boundary marker. And Mr. Sterling, the temporary receiver, caught between the surprise of David's presence and the urgency of his illegal nocturnal operation. The air crackled with hostility and the scent of newly disturbed earth. This operation is authorized by the receiver's emergency mandate to protect the asset from documented obstruction, Mr. Sterling shouted, his face contorted in a mix of fury and panic. He knew this public confrontation, witnessed by the construction crew, threatened the cold legal control Omnia had maintained. Any interference constitutes further aggravated obstruction of justice, Mr. Vance, and Mr. Hawthorne, you are violating the curfew set by the receivership. David Vance stepped closer, his voice ringing with the clarity of a man who had chosen his conscience over comfort. I resigned my executive position this evening, Mr. Sterling. I am here as a private citizen and a witness to a planned act of corporate vandalism. I have already provided counsel with internal documents proving that the mineral claims are a pretense and that this rushed excavation is a desperate attempt to cover up a critical known hydrological failure on the adjacent Thorne property. This is corporate fraud, not protection of an asset. The entire development plan is based on a lie. The construction crew, local men likely hired through Eleanor Vane's compromised logistics, began to hesitate. They were laborers, not corporate conspirators, and the mention of fraud and water failure immediately shook their compliance. "This is baseless slander," Sterling roared into his radio, clearly calling for legal reinforcement. "Proceed with the perimeter fencing and initiate the test drill immediately." As the fence crew resumed their work, two men attempted to maneuver the heavy excavation drill closer to the ancient oak. Elias, seeing the imminent threat to the land's protected water source, acted. He descended the porch steps, walking slowly but purposefully toward the massive stone boundary marker on David's trailer. "Do not defile this land with your lies," Elias said, his voice quiet but commanding. He pointed to the drill. "That drill is meant to destroy the fragile underground spring that great-grandfather Silas Hawthorne protected with the 1928 covenant. This is not about minerals. It is about the water you are stealing from the future of this community." He paused, then turned to the workers, appealing directly to their moral sense. "Every man here has neighbors, perhaps children, who rely on clean water. Omnia's actions here tonight are a direct threat to that resource. Do not be a party to an act of corporate corruption." The two men operating the drill stopped, looking uneasily at Mr. Sterling and then at the ground. David Vance seized the moment, pulling a small printed document from his pocket, a copy of the 1927 water survey. "The truth is right here," David announced, holding up the paper for the workers to see. "This land, the one you are about to excavate, is the only source of viable water for the entire development project uphill. They are lying to the government and to the public. If you drill here, you will collapse the spring and ruin the water security of the entire region. This is a crime against the community." The most surprising reaction came from one of the young construction workers, a man whose face was etched with fatigue and concern. He lowered his drill controls, stepping away from the heavy machine. "I have family that relies on the well system upriver," he muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not doing this, boss. I'm not drilling for a cover-up." His refusal was a spark. One by one, others followed suit, putting down their tools. The corporate siege had been broken, not by legal action, but by a moral appeal to the conscience of the local workers. Sterling, realizing the operation was collapsing, grabbed his radio. "Omnia Legal is on their way. This is far from over." Elias didn't wait. He spoke into the phone, talking to Mr. Davies, who was rushing to the scene. "Mr. Davies, the operation is stalled. File an immediate emergency motion for the immediate removal of the receiver. citing their malicious, criminal-level attempt to destroy critical evidence and public resources in violation of their fiduciary duty to the court and the community. Use the workers' testimony. Use David Vance's internal documents. We have them on corporate fraud and attempted criminal vandalism. The final decisive legal maneuver took place just hours later in the sterile silence of the judge's chambers. Mr. Davies, fueled by coffee and sheer adrenaline, presented the massive motion. The evidence was irrefutable. 1. Corporate fraud. David Vance's internal memos proved Omnia and Ethelred were fully aware of the 1927 water survey and the 1928 covenant, yet fabricated the mineral claim as a pretext to demolish the house and gain access to the water source. 2. Obstruction of justice. The certified covenant, now filed, proved the binding nature of the mineral restrictions. Omnia's attempt to preemptively destroy the spring, hours before the final hearing, confirmed their malicious intent to destroy crucial evidence of their hydrological dependency. 3. Moral corruption. The use of the arrest warrant on Marcus as a blackmail tool and the leveraging of Eleanor Vane's small business as a front for a nighttime demolition demonstrated a pattern of severe moral and legal malpractice. Ms. Kincaid, who finally arrived, attempted to counter, arguing that the sudden revelation of the covenant and water survey was evidence that the Hawthorns themselves had been concealing information and that the receiver was merely acting on the possibility of fraud. The judge, however, looked severely shaken. The sheer volume and damning nature of the certified documents, combined with the sworn affidavits from the construction workers and the explosive testimony from a former Omnia executive director, proved that Omnia had deliberately misled the court for months. Ms. Kincaid, the judge stated, his voice stern, the court is not blind to manipulation. Your client's actions last night, based on a fabricated urgency, combined with the clear evidence of fraudulent concealment of the 1927 water survey and the certified 1928 covenant, lead to an inescapable conclusion. Your client has committed a profound fraud upon this court and engaged in reckless, potentially criminal behavior that endangers public resources. The hammer fell, bringing with it the long-awaited reversal of fortune. I hereby grant the motion for the immediate removal of the temporary receiver, effective immediately. Mr. Sterling's tenure is terminated and all associated corporate activities on the property cease. I also immediately grant the motion to quash the arrest warrant for Marcus Hawthorne, finding that the charge of aggravated obstruction was filed with malicious intent and was part of a larger pattern of corporate coercion. Ms. Kincaid stood speechless, the scale of her defeat visible on her face. Furthermore, the judge continued, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. Given the overwhelming evidence of deliberate corporate fraud and malicious prosecution presented in the counterclaim, I am ordering a temporary cease and desist on the sale of the adjacent Thorne property and scheduling an immediate full-scale evidentiary hearing to determine the full extent of Omnia Holdings' malfeasance, with the possibility of referring this case to the State Attorney General for criminal investigation. The judicial sale was stopped. The receiver was removed. Marcus was exonerated. The truth finally was not just recognized but affirmed by the law. The Hawthorns had won the war for their integrity and their home, and they had, in the process, exposed a corporate crime that protected an entire community. Elias walked out of the courtroom, Clara by his side, the immense pressure of the last weeks finally lifting. Justice had been served, secured by their unwavering commitment to truth and the timely, painful sacrifice of David Vance. But the trial wasn't completely over. The final verdict on the title, and the consequences for Omnia, still needed to be rendered. They knew, however, that with the judicial sale halted and the fraud exposed, the final victory was inevitable. The family's faith and unity had been their ultimate defense. The air in the courtroom on the day of the final evidentiary hearing was thick, heavy with the weight of consequence. This wasn't a mere procedural review. It was a reckoning. The Hawthorne family sat together, a united front. Elias, his composure restored by the quashing of his son's arrest warrant. Clara, her anxiety channeled into fierce protective resolve. And Marcus returned from his temporary exile, sitting straighter than ever, a quiet testament to the cost of their integrity. Sophia, too young to be legally involved but emotionally invested, watched every movement with intense focus. David Vance, prepared to testify to the corporate fraud he had helped expose, sat near their counsel, Mr. Davies, his face grim but clear. Opposite them, Ms. Kincaid sat alone, her firm's large legal table now conspicuously empty. Omnia Holdings, reeling from the judge's ruling and facing the prospect of criminal investigation, had retreated, sending Kincaid as a sacrificial lamb to salvage what little dignity remained. CEO Vivian Thorne was absent, her reputation and her project now in catastrophic jeopardy. Mr. Davies began the day by formally presenting the certified documents, the 1927 hydrological stress test showing the critical water dependency of the Thorne property, and the certified 1928 deed of trust and boundary settlement from the defunct TWRA archives, which proved the perpetual and binding nature of the mineral rights restriction. He coupled this with David Vance's internal memos, which detailed Omnia's deliberate months-long conspiracy to conceal this evidence, fabricate a mineral claim, and use the legal system to coerce the Hawthorns. The prosecution of Omnia's actions was clinical and devastating. Mr. Davies methodically built a case for malicious prosecution and fraud upon the court, arguing that Omnia's entire lawsuit was a calculated act of corporate warfare designed not to secure title, but to preemptively destroy the evidence, the underground spring, that invalidated their multi-million-dollar development plan. Then came the testimonies. Elias Hawthorne took the stand first. He spoke not as a legal expert, but as a historian and a man of faith. He recounted the history of the house, starting with his great-grandfather, Silas, who had sought not just land, but a moral foundation for his family. He explained the foresight of the 1928 covenant, portraying it not as a legal loophole, but as a deliberate act of stewardship, protecting the land and its resources for future generations. Omnia Holdings treated the law as a weapon, Elias testified, his voice steady, directed at the judge. They did not care about the house or the mineral rights. They cared only about their bottom line, and they were willing to lie to this court, attack my family's reputation, and threaten my son's liberty to conceal the truth about the water. My great-grandfather knew that a lie buried deep in the earth would eventually rise to the surface. We fought not just for our property, but for the principle that integrity must matter more than profit. Ms. Kincaid's cross-examination was brief and weak, attempting only to suggest that Elias had also concealed the 1928 covenant in his attic. Elias simply responded, "I disclosed the document the moment I discovered its existence. Omnia failed to disclose it for months, even after their legal counsel photographed it, because they knew it would unravel their fraudulent scheme. The concealment was theirs, not mine." The next witness was David Vance. His testimony was the emotional core of the morning. Wearing a simple dark suit, he spoke with profound humility, describing his father's initial moral lapse in 1955 and his own far greater sin of silence when he first discovered Omnia's duplicity in the Ethelred files. He detailed how Omnia had actively sought to bury the 1927 water survey and how he had resigned his executive directorship, sacrificing his entire career and financial stability because his conscience demanded he expose the crime. "I was given a choice," David stated, his voice thick with emotion. "Protect my career, my reputation, and my non-disclosure agreement, or stand for the truth and integrity I was taught. The Hawthorne family stood for the truth when I was silent. I came forward because I realized that protecting a corporate lie is the ultimate betrayal, a betrayal of my faith, my principles, and the memory of my own father, who spent his life regretting his original mistake." His confession was devastatingly honest, painting a vivid picture of the moral corruption at the heart of Omnia. Then Clara Hawthorne took the stand. Her testimony was precise and devastating. She detailed the emotional and financial violence inflicted on her family, the asset freeze, the public smear campaign, the threat to her son, and the agonizing moral dilemma of the settlement offer. She connected the dots between the internal memos and the receiver's actions, demonstrating the perfect synchronization of the legal and moral attacks. She concluded with a clear, unwavering statement: "We refused the $5 million settlement and the guarantee of my son's freedom because accepting it would have required us to sign an NDA, making us complicit in concealing the water risk from the community." A home is just a building, Your Honor. Our legacy is our integrity, and no amount of money or corporate pressure could justify sacrificing the truth that protects the people who live here. Her testimony was followed by a sworn affidavit from the construction worker who had refused to drill, solidifying the narrative of Omnia's criminal intent in the pre-dawn raid. As the day progressed, the case against Omnia moved past the realm of simple title law into an examination of corporate ethics and malicious intent. Ms. Kincaid, visibly defeated, offered a final desperate plea, arguing that the court should simply grant the Hawthorns clear title to the house and allow Omnia to pay a fine for the procedural misconduct, thus protecting their shareholders. "We have already halted all development," she stated, her voice faltering. "The court has the certified covenant. Simply grant the Hawthorns full title and let my client withdraw the rest of the suit. Further investigation will only drag the local economy through unnecessary scrutiny." Mr. Davies stood for his final argument, his voice ringing with conviction. "Your Honor, this case is no longer about who owns the property. It is about whether justice can be bought and suppressed by corporate power. Omnia Holdings used the machinery of this court to perpetrate a fraud against a family and a community. They must not be allowed to simply withdraw and bury their crime with a fine. The Hawthorns, through perseverance and moral clarity, have provided this court with irrefutable proof of corporate deceit and the intentional destruction of public resources. We ask not just for clear title, but for an award of punitive damages that will send an unequivocal message to every corporation that seeks to weaponize the law. We ask for justice to be served, completely and publicly." The judge looked down from the bench, his expression grave. He had watched a local family endure a brutal, targeted siege, and he had seen the shocking level of corruption orchestrated by a massive, wealthy entity. He did not issue a judgment immediately, reserving the verdict to consider the punitive damages and the final order. "The court is in recess," he stated, his voice heavy with the magnitude of the decision. "I will issue the final verdict tomorrow morning." The tension remained. The house was safe, Marcus was cleared, but the final, definitive resolution, the absolute affirmation of their truth, was still pending. As the family rose to leave, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and a stern, uniformed man emerged. He walked directly past Ms. Kincaid, ignoring her desperate glance, and placed a formal, sealed envelope on Mr. Davies's table. Mr. Davies picked it up, his face etched with confusion. "What is this?" The man, a messenger for the State Attorney General's office, spoke with official formality. "This is a formal warrant for judicial seizure of corporate records and a subpoena to testify for Ms. Vivian Thorne, CEO of Omnia Holdings. The Attorney General's office has commenced a full criminal investigation based on the evidence presented in this hearing." Mr. Davies's eyes went wide as he looked at Elias. The long, brutal fight had escalated far beyond their initial goal of saving the house. Their integrity and perseverance had not only secured their own property, but had triggered a massive state-level action against the corporate power that had tried to crush them. The verdict was still a day away, but the final, devastating consequence for their powerful corporate opponent had just begun. The true reward for their stand was the public exposure of the corruption they had endured. The following morning, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, not just for the Hawthorns, but for the local community that had followed the saga through the media and the devastating revelation of the water fraud. When the judge entered, the entire room fell into a silence so absolute it was palpable. The judge began by addressing the overarching themes of the case, his voice grave and measured. "This court has spent considerable time reviewing the evidence presented in the final evidentiary hearing. We have witnessed a calculated and protracted attempt by a massive corporate entity, Omnia Holdings, to weaponize the legal system for the purpose of profit, culminating in a deliberate act of fraud upon this court and an endangerment of public resources." He began the formal judgment with the definitive resolution of the title dispute. Based on the certified documentation provided by the plaintiffs, the 1927 Hydrological Survey, and the perpetually binding 1928 Deed of Trust, which Omnia Holdings actively sought to conceal, the court finds that the defendant, Omnia Holdings, had no legitimate claim to the mineral rights of the Hawthorne property, and therefore their entire lawsuit was baseless and founded on deliberate deception. The judge slammed his gavel once, the sound echoing through the room. The court hereby issues a final judgment in favor of the Hawthorne family. The Hawthorne family's title to their property, including full surface and subsurface rights, is quieted and declared free and clear of all claims by Omnia Holdings or any of its predecessors or subsidiaries. Omnia Holdings and all affiliated entities are permanently barred from accessing or developing the property. A wave of quiet, profound relief washed over Elias and Clara. Their home was safe. The judge then moved on to the financial and punitive consequences, the part of the verdict that would truly hold Omnia accountable. The court must address the egregious behavior of the corporate defendant, the deliberate malicious prosecution, the abuse of the receivership, the attempted blackmail of the plaintiff's minor son, and the intentional use of a fraudulent claim to conceal a major public risk, the water vulnerability, constitute an unprecedented pattern of legal and moral misconduct. He outlined the financial penalty. The court orders Omnia Holdings to pay the Hawthorne family full and complete compensation for all legal fees, the costs incurred during the receivership, and the severe emotional distress caused by the prolonged coercion and malicious defamation. The total amount awarded for compensatory damages is $1.2 million. The figure was massive, a complete vindication of the Hawthornes' financial struggle. But the final part of the verdict was the most severe, a message to every corporation that might consider a similar scheme. Given the severity of the fraud and the malicious intent, the court awards the plaintiffs punitive damages in the amount of $25 million against Omnia Holdings. This award is designed to serve as a powerful deterrent against the weaponization of the legal system and the concealment of information that affects public safety and resource integrity. The gasp in the courtroom was audible. $25 million, a staggering sum that would not only crush Omnia's fraudulent development project, but would also serve as a public, humiliating rebuke to CEO Vivian Thorne. Finally, the judge concluded, looking directly at the empty Omnia table, in light of the evidence presented by Mr. David Vance and the compelling documentation of the 1927 water survey, this court orders the immediate and permanent halt of all development on the adjacent Thorne property until a full independent hydrological and environmental study, mandated by the state attorney general, can confirm the long-term water viability of the site. The seizure warrant issued by the Attorney General for Omnia Holdings corporate records remains active. The integrity of this community's resources will be protected. The gavel struck 3 times, a final deafening sound of justice being rendered. The room erupted. The small crowd that had supported the Hawthornes cheered. Elias and Clara embraced, the immense weight of the last few months finally dissolving into tears of gratitude and profound relief. Marcus and Sophia rushed to hug their parents, their eyes shining with pride and joy. The family's integrity had not only survived the fire but had emerged purified and rewarded. Later that afternoon, back on their now protected property, the sun shone warmly on the old house. The ugly chain-link fence erected by the receiver was gone, hauled away as evidence. The drilling equipment, now legally impounded, was gone. The only things that remained were the deep tire tracks in the grass, scars that would eventually heal, serving as quiet reminders of the siege. Elias and Clara stood together near the ancient oak, the physical center of their entire battle. David Vance approached them, carrying the old heavy iron chest that had held the first piece of the covenant. "I came to say goodbye," David said, his voice quiet. "I have lost my career, but I have found my peace. My father's regret is finally finished. I'm starting a small, honest business, perhaps repairing furniture." He extended his hand to Elias. "Your faith, Mr. Hawthorne, saved all of us." "Your integrity saved us, David," Elias corrected, embracing him. "You showed us that one honest man can stand up to 1,000 lies. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten." As David left, a local news helicopter buzzing overhead reminded them that their victory was now public. Clara looked at Elias, a thoughtful smile on her face. "The world knows the truth now, Papa. The shame Omnia tried to put on us has been transferred to them." Elias nodded, his gaze sweeping across his land, clear and free. He pointed to the stone boundary marker that David had retrieved. They tried to take our foundation, Clara, but they failed. Our foundation was never in the deed of the land. It was in the deed of our faith and the truth we held on to. The fight is over, and we are home." He looked at his children, who were already making plans to repair the tire tracks, their energy a testament to their unbroken spirit. The Hawthorne family had faced the deepest betrayal and the fiercest corporate coercion, and they had emerged not just with their home, but with their principles intact, securing a moral and legal victory that would echo in their community for generations. The legacy of Silas Hawthorne's foresight, protected by his descendants' unwavering integrity, had finally prevailed.